Ray Kurzweil has been telling us that the singularity is near and getting nearer. Peter Diamandis argues we're entering an age of abundance where the future is better than we think. At the same time, some of the world's smartest scientists warn that the doomsday clock of existential risk sits at just about 85 seconds to midnight, while Eliezer Yudkowsky's recent bestseller bluntly predicts that if anyone builds AI, everyone's dead. Utopia or dystopia? A golden age or a dark age? Perhaps even an apocalypse. That's the perceived spectrum of our future. My name is Nicola, and you're watching Singularity FM, the place where we interview the future. If you guys enjoy this podcast, you can show your support by leaving a review on iTunes or by simply becoming a patron via interviewthefuture.com. My guest today is Professor Ada Palmer. Ada is a historian who studies how societies invent their golden ages and their dark ages, especially during moments of information upheaval, from the print revolution to our digital present. In her latest book, Inventing the Renaissance, The Myth of a Golden Age, she argues that the Renaissance wasn't an enlightened awakening from the Dark Ages, but a story people told to make sense of, justify, and legitimize their present, much like our possible futures we're arguing over today. This is our third interview, and I highly recommend everyone review our previous two conversations, as we will try to repeat as little as possible and focus fully on Ada's latest masterpiece of a book. So, welcome to Singularity FM, Ada.
Thank you. It's a delight to be back. You're the best interviewer I've ever had.
Oh, wow. Thank you. I think I'm going to... I'm losing my speech here. Okay. Ada, I noticed a minor inconsistency in the subtitles of your book across editions. Specifically, your hardcover is titled Inventing the Renaissance, Myths of a Golden Age, but all the other editions seem to be titled Inventing the Renaissance, The Myth of a Golden Age. Is there any significance to this, or am I just being overly picky given my obsessive attention to detail?
It's a detail worth paying attention to. That decision was made by the UK versus US publishers. So the UK and World edition, the edition that is in libraries and museum gift shops in Europe and so on, and in Australia and in Canada, is the UK edition, which has myths, plural, of a golden age. The US edition has the myth of a golden age. And I always find it fascinating to look at when a book has different subtitles in each. So, for example, Greenblatt's The Swerve, which is a book that Inventing the Renaissance is very much in dialogue with, had two different subtitles in UK versus US. And I think the US was How the World Became Modern. And the UK one was like the creation or invention of the Renaissance, in effect. So that the UK title focused it on is historicity, and the US title on the idea of the forming of our present. And it was actually the UK editor who suggested, well, what if it's myths plural? Because you do talk about how there are multiple myths of the Renaissance. There are the myths they tell in their own day, but there are also myths told in the 18th century and in the 19th century, and there are nationalistic myths, and there are capitalist versus communist myths, myths plural. And I loved myths plural. And then the US publisher didn't want to do that. They wanted to project a simpler narrative, which they thought would be less intimidating. Whereas I think the pluralness of the narratives in the book is the whole heart of it. So it was a fascinating set of conversations to have with the different editors. Is this one monolithic myth changing over time, or is this plural competing myths adding to each other like the proliferation of species?
As an original European, I am very much on the myths plural side of the title and of that debate. Unfortunately, the American argument kind of justifies my stereotypes. of those publishers in North America, including Canada, by the way. We're not much different in Canada, and about sort of the way they want to target their books, whereas the Europeans are a lot less concerned with the market appeal and a lot more concerned with perhaps the actual message you're trying to send. How horrible of a stereotype is that, huh?
Mm. Well, I think that in the US there is a lot of pressure to assume that you need to target a low common denominator to have commercial success with everything. And Europe is more willing to say, you know what, if we don't sell to the low common denominator, we'll sell to a high one. And there are lots of people who are reading or watching at that level as well. I noticed it when the two 2012 Borgia TV series were made, and the American one vastly simplified the politics because it assumed you couldn't understand.
Right.
And the European one was much more willing to just trust the viewer to follow complicated politics and leave it complicated.
Yeah, there was actually a Netflix series. Is that what you're talking about? And Dustin Hoffman was playing one of the Medici.
That was the Medici TV series, which was after the two successes of the two 2012 Borgia TV series, one of which was Showtime, and the other one was a collaborative production between several different European studios, though both were shot in English.
Right. Yeah, fascinating. Okay, let's jump into the meat of the matter here, and we start with your title, which we already went into the subtitle, but let's back up a bit and go into the title, and there's a key word there. Well, there's two key words, but one is inventing and the other is the Renaissance, right? Let's talk about the word Renaissance. What does that word actually mean? And what assumptions are already smuggled in it when we use that word, Renaissance?
Right. So as rebirth in a literal sense, it implies that something was and that something isn't now, but that something is going to be or is about to be or could be again. So by its very nature, it looks backward and it perceives a better earlier thing. It criticizes the present and the recent past and makes the argument that change for the better is change backward and not change forward.
So in other words, isn't it calling something a rebirth implicitly an insult to the people who came right before it? In other words, does the Renaissance definition require a dark age to exist before it?
Exactly. And the idea that there's a Renaissance or a golden age in this period is parallel and inseparable from the besmirching and derision of the Middle Ages. And that is actually what is one of the newest things that comes about in the Renaissance at the very end of the 1300s, is the first idea of dividing Europe's history into three parts, with a good ancient age, a bad recent Middle Age, described by Petrarch as an age of ash and shadow. And then that a good and better age can come about by imitating the good thing that is lost before. So indeed, the notion of a golden age or of a Renaissance requires a negatively defined age, however artificial that negative definition may be.
Yeah, one of my sins, of which I have way too many, like countless, was being nasty to my mother-in-law once, and she's a very Republican, Roman Catholic, Italian, very nice lady. And, once she was ranting the way she does about the diminished power of the church on our society, and the loss of the family and all the values and this and that. And then me, being at my most nastiest, retorted back something to the effect that when the church was at its most powerful, we commonly refer to that period of time as the Dark Ages. Now, that was a few years ago, and I wasn't quite enlightened that Petrarch invented that kind of put down. And I certainly haven't read your book yet, which now has completely turned upside down my entire way of perceiving the Renaissance or any golden age anywhere in the world, by the way. And I would always now be thinking about Ada's book, so I want to thank you for that. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to bring you over here and talk about this, because I think there's a lot to be learned, not just about the Renaissance, but about today, where we're finding ourselves today, and about the decisions and choices we make for our future, and how some people try to insult the period exactly before our present so that they can militarize or employ that kind of a tool to push us toward a specific political or other agenda.
And often Renaissance is criticizing both the recent past and the present in which the speaker is not yet in a position of power, right? It's a promise that if we implement X, we will have a Renaissance. We're on the threshold of a Renaissance. If we get elected, if we get funding, if we get power, if this social experiment moves forward, if this reform movement takes shape, if this party displaces the other party, if this church displaces the other church, whatever it is, when we do that, which we're on the threshold of, then there will be a golden age. So it often is a criticism of the present alongside criticizing the recent past, lumping them in with each other, and then making claims about something can happen that will bring back or create something that will then be better than and replace our bad recent past and present with something resembling our much better earlier past.
Yeah. So there is an image that you identified, that word, the Renaissance, in your book. And I want you to unpack that image for us. And the image I'm specifically referring to is the fact that in the book you compare the idea of a golden age to glitter paint. It's beautiful, it's seductive, but it's superficial.
Yeah, and it interferes with seeing the details underneath because it's thick and gloppy, right? So in Florence today, you can buy a million different replicas of Michelangelo's David, and you can buy white ones, you can buy pink ones, and you can buy blue ones, and you can buy ones that have glitter paint smeared all over them. And they're very eye-catching, and they're very striking when you see them in the shop window. And I see people purchase them, but when you look at them, you can't see the details. You can't see the sculpting of the hands. You can't see the tension and in his face. You can't see the concentration, the anxiety, all of the subtleties that are what made the David an innovative statue. And so all of the things that are actually unique and new about it are erased under the glitter, and you just see the glitter. And I think that's a lot of how we see the Renaissance, because we have this idea of it as a glittering golden age. And we go to museum exhibits and we see all this gorgeous art. We see Renaissance art reproduced, and we find it beautiful, and we're taught from a young age to form our tastes so that we find it beautiful. And we think the age that left us these glorious glittering treasures must have been a golden age. And in the book, I'm trying to scrape that glitter paint off and say what is actually the beautiful and amazing detail underneath, which made people recognize Michelangelo's David as a unique and innovative work, which made people recognize this moment as a moment of change, because it isn't that it was great and glorious and beautiful and left us gorgeous stuff. And as you know, I begin the book by quoting my favorite Renaissance text I've ever read, which is this letter Machiavelli received. He had just finished the first half of a history of the decade they had just lived through. And this is the decade that spans the year 1500. And a friend of his who was a mercenary captain who had fought alongside him in battles read the history and wrote to Machiavelli and said, Machiavelli, you must finish your history of this moment, or future generations will never believe how bad it was. And they will never forgive us for losing so much so quickly. But he's talking about he's talking about the decade in which Michelangelo carved the David and Leonardo painted the Mona Lisa. Right. Raphael is at work. Josquin des Prez is composing. All of the things that we think of as the most golden and most glorious of the Renaissance were created in a decade that, for those who lived through it, felt like an apocalypse. in which the future would never forgive them. I could easily imagine somebody reading half a history of this decade and writing to someone and saying, you need to finish your history or future generations will never forgive us for what is happening in the last 2 years. Lots of us could imagine that letter being written about this decade. And it's unimaginable to pair this feeling with thinking 250 years from now, people will call this a golden age. But they might if they look at the stuff that we leave to the future that is preserved in museums. And if they look at the list of inventions that they still have, that illusion, that glitter paint covering over how terrified we all feel all the time and how apocalyptic it feels on the ground is exactly what Machiavelli and his peers were feeling in 1506.
Yeah, and in a way, shocking as that is, you could say that Petrarch succeeded in popular mind without them being aware of him, that yes, the popular imagination took the image of the Dark Ages, took the image of the Golden Age, and so on and so on. And now you have done a tremendous job with your book, but people have to go through, like, I don't know, 800 pages or 30 hours as an audio version like I did before they actually get that message. And then we have to fight that for that point of view every time we are in a public conversation with people who haven't read your book and haven't been in the details, simply because the images of the Golden Age and the Dark Age are so powerful and overwhelming.
They're so narratively satisfying, right? They're simple, they make sense. You know, in my other hat as a science fiction and fantasy writer, when you're making up the backstory for your imaginary world, it's so easy to say, well, there was an excellent era, and then a terrible thing happened, and a dark lord rose, or an evil corporation took over, and then there was a dark age, and everything was terrible. And now there is a second thing happening, and now there's a new golden age. It's so easy and satisfying, and you put those little details into the book and the reader immediately recognizes them and it makes perfect sense and they're with you. And if you try to do a more complicated nuance, there were complicated developments in which banking and finance meant the trade accelerated, you've lost people. Because that complexity is harder for us to nail down. But cycles of history, great ages and then dark ages, these feel like they make sense. And one problem when you come up with a theory that then turns out to be wrong, or a piece of propaganda that then turns out to be wrong, is if it's really narratively satisfying, it can be very difficult to get people out of believing that thing when you realize, oops, I was wrong.
Yeah. You know, who was this great author or writer who said, people don't like thinking because thinking can make them conclude and ultimately do something they don't want to. And so they would rather take the story as it is and not think about it, because if they actually think about it, they may discover an alternative, they may discover that it's wrong, and that may then necessitate further work and further action, and they just don't want to go through that kind of pain and effort.
Well, I think that's part of it, but that there are two other aspects to why people struggle to believe the complicated narrative instead of the dark and golden age one, both of which are a bit more respectful of human intelligence. One is actually Occam's razor, right? Dark age and golden age is really simple. It's a really simple explanation and it makes sense. And when you compare it to a much more complicated, fussy explanation, your instinct of what this one is simple and I can wrap my head around it, and Occam's razor is on its side, is a test that we're taught to think logically, to say that the simpler explanation is often true. So we are exercising reason when we look at the simple, straightforward, comprehensible versus the weird and complicated. There's a great passage in Cicero where he talks about a lawyer having to make a case, and that sometimes you have a good case and sometimes you have a bad case where you're arguing against the grain and it's hard, and sometimes you have a strange case where the situation is just really complicated and weird and hard to believe and involves a lot of detail. And that usually if you're making a strange case, you've lost. Because even if you're right and truth is on your side, if the truth is too complicated and dismaying, people will struggle and say, but there are, 52 steps in that logic chain. If even one of them was deceiving me, it feels like it could be wrong. And that it's actually very difficult to make the strange case, which is why the book is so long, for one thing, but also, why often when people start giving an explanation and they're 3 sentences in, you're like, okay, but then they keep going and, here's why I didn't do my homework. And then this happened, and then this happened. And by the time you're the 7th thing, they're making the strange case, and it becomes harder to believe. History requires us to defy Occam's razor and accept the strange case over the case that makes sense, counter to many of our instincts as scientists and as practitioners of good logical practice. So I think that's half the challenge. I think the other half is that one of the things that the idea of a golden age and dark age does is lend into the larger idea of cycles of history and images of history, where the way history works is that there are big forces that grind on like giant gears, and they mesh in certain ways, and when they get to a certain point, then a thing happens. And there's a rise, and then there's a peak, and then there's a decline and a fall, and all of these fat forces are big forces, massive forces of wealth percentages and economic relations, in which the actions of an individual are no more significant than a single grain of sand among the vast dunes that are moving and taking shape. And weirdly, counterintuitively, it's very comforting and stress relieving to believe that you don't have any meaningful power in these big forces, because then you don't have to face the burden of the future builder, of waking up every morning and saying, my actions make a difference in the future of the world, and everyone I love will actually be affected by my choices. It's very relaxing to instead wake up and say, there are giant gears grinding on. They will grind on regardless of what I do. I therefore should do whatever makes sense to me to do, because the great forces don't depend on me. I'm just one inert thing moving within their gears. It's the same reason that humans find the apocalypse incredibly reassuring. And there's a brilliant book by Eugene Weber called Apocalypses, which is a 3,000-year history of humans' fascination and obsession with a variety of different apocalypses. And every time an apocalypse passes by, we immediately come up with a new apocalypse to fret about. And a lot of people are like, why do people find the apocalypse emotionally appealing? The apocalypse is incredibly appealing because it relieves you of long-term duties, and it means that the small choices you're making now don't matter. You can continue to make your small choices based on your own needs, your own stresses, your own desperations. You can continue to cultivate your own garden and take care of your own needs, because the world is going to end soon. So there aren't many, many generations of the future dependent upon you. And it's really fascinating how constantly, no matter how many apocalypses drift by and don't affect us, we immediately find and fear and also find comfort in another one, because doom is very emotionally satisfying and relaxing. Hope is incredibly stressful.
Yeah, and it requires work, by the way, much more so than doom. But that brings me to your first point that you just brought with one of your colleagues, Charlie Strauss, who actually expressed exactly the opposite opinion. He said, simple and easy narratives that explain everything are usually wrong. Right? So, and you know that's why you wrote this 800 page long book, to prove that it's not so simple as dark and gold and all of that that's been said before. But most people would go for the simple and easy, and yet Charlie Strauss comes in and he says, and they're usually wrong. So the world is complicated. That was his final message after at the end of our conversation.
Yeah. I think that many people employ both logics at different points, because we sometimes look for simplicity and meet it and find it, and sometimes looking for simplicity is the correct thing, right? But we also sometimes say, yeah, this is a big complex thing, that trite explanation is too trite. my wariness should go up. And so one of the challenges we face as logicians is, when is Occam's razor good guidance? And when is Occam's razor a temptation to be seduced by propaganda? And sometimes it's one and sometimes it's the other. And we have to exercise our human reason to judge when we should trust and when we should distrust the simpler option.
That's so funny you said it. I just finished an interview with Graham Priest, who is the world's foremost dialectist logician, and how we were talking about the fact that what we commonly refer to as classical logic is no longer even in vibe among logicians. It has endless number of problems, and there's a dozen other logics, intuitionist, dialectist, fuzzy logic, Boolean logic. There's a dozen other logics which allow us to look at the world and seek the best possible theory or solution or way to reason about things, which to me was a total revelation, even though I have an undergraduate degree in philosophy. And as a result of that, I had to take logic, modern symbolic logic course. You know, I struggled in that course, but I remember that was 25 years ago. If I had gone to my professor at the time and told him, look, man, there's like 11 other logics other than classical logic of Frege and Bertrand Russell, and, you know, there's been so much progress made since these two guys, I would have probably failed the class.
I hope you would have a professor good enough to recognize that you should not fail the class for bringing in even richer material. But this gets at an interesting thing that was one of the biggest debates within the Renaissance itself, as you know, between the scholastics and the humanisti, who we call humanists, but we have to be very careful of that term because its modern baggage does not apply the same way to the people referred to as humanisti in the period, because for the last century and a half or 2 centuries of what we now call the Middle Ages, the new fashionable, exciting form of education was scholastic education, which focused on logic. And among the classical trivium of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, logic was queen. The idea being that you could use these very careful technical rules, harvested from Aristotle and refined by Thomas Aquinas and his scholastic ancestors, to prove things with great clarity, to prove with certainty, to solve big puzzles that people wrestled with, like how, if God is perfectly just, can we also say God is merciful when mercy is the suspension of justice and the granting of mercy to those who deserve punishment? Mercy and justice are logical opposites, so how can God be both? People are worried about questions like this, and they try to use logic to prove things. And with great erudition and detail, they do, right, to a degree that impresses the society enormously. When Thomas Aquinas goes up for canonization, they make the argument that every single one of the chapters of the Summa Theologica is itself a miracle because of the precision of its logic. And this argument is upheld, and officially every single chapter of the Summa Theologica is a miracle of precision of logic. But the criticism that Petrarch then makes is, it can persuade you logically that X is true, but that doesn't necessarily move you to act upon X. Look at all of the hypocrisy in our world where people, if you ask them what are God's rules, will agree that one of them is thou shalt not kill, and yet also participate in all the different feuds and honor duels and things, not to mention warfare, that involve committing homicide and breaking that law. So why are people saying X is true and yet not acting on X? Logic clearly isn't moving people's action. And the debate then is, what can move people's action? And they land on rhetoric. The words that sting and bite, the beautiful arguments that move your emotions and make you want to be, want to do, want to implement whatever the good act or good deed is, rather than merely logically agreeing that it's good. Anyone who has ever been more moved by a poem than by an essay, anyone who has been more moved by a beautiful painting representing something that moved you to tears or moved you to grief or moved you to joy, when a extremely precise description of the same thing would not, has experienced their argument that there are emotional levels of persuasion that are parallel to logical levels of persuasion, but that seem to have more power over the will, more power over the ability to get people to act upon a thing. Another way you can argue is that it's lived experience, direct experience of a thing, and that art and artistry can give us a vicarious form of lived experience.
Yeah, and to me it was interesting that Graham also agreed with you in a sense, and that wasn't even point of our conversation, but he brought the point that what we commonly call the Dark Ages were actually very interesting from a logician's point of view, because there were tremendous logical improvements and accomplishments in terms of logic within scholasticism. And, which reminded me, because in my keynotes, several times I have ranted against scholasticism, and maybe we'll touch later on about that. And I draw a modern point between classical scholasticism and today's STEM funding, and how, the humanities and the arts were a reaction to scholasticism, and the whole humanism came in, and how now I'm pushing for STEAM rather than STEM. So we will maybe touch upon that later, but the point that he made was that scholasticism made tremendous progress in terms of logic from Aristotle, who is now completely considered wrong, and all of his arguments are terrible, actually. Pretty much everything he said has been proven to be wrong. But most of it is lost, because after the humanists came to the fore, the logical progress that the scholastics made, according to him, is now lost. And that to him was sad. So then people had to reinvent the whole field in the late 19th and early 20th century, where Russell and Frege come, and they sort of organized all the mess and synchronized it with math and all that stuff, statistics. And that was commonly created or coined to be called classical logic, which actually is not really classical, because when you say something is classical, you often consider that it's connected to Rome or ancient Greece in one way or another, but it totally isn't. So when you say classical logic, it's not that logic of the Greeks and the Romans, but it's the logic of Frege and Russell of the 19th and 20th century.
Well, this is one of the ways where classical is a really unhelpful word a lot of the time, like modern, which is such a terrible word. And modern means something completely different in every field. If you ask people in any profession, when is the beginning of modern in their specialty?
Modernity,
they'll give you a different decade or a different century. Modern computing, 1980s or 2000s. Modern art, end of the 19th century. Modern baseball, 1960s. But modern literature in Italian is 1250, right? And if I go out the front door of my office and turn right down the hallway to the English department, and I ask them when is modern and when is the Renaissance, they will give me a date that is 300 years later than if I turn left down the same hallway and ask my Italianist colleagues when is modern.
Right.
Modern is a word that needs to be fired, but it's also a word that we can't live without. Like many of the best words.
Exactly, and that's why you explicitly invite the reader to judge your story the way we judge a friend telling us a story. And so you're asking for judgment, not neutrality, because that's essential to what you say. It's essential to doing history honestly. Tell me more about that.
So partly, I think it's two different things. One is, all historians are biased. Even if we're trying very, very, very hard to be fair and to not be partisan, we're inescapably biased in the questions it occurs to us to ask. And different people think of asking different questions, and even those introduce different levels of bias, right? So I'm chronically ill and very interested in disability, and whenever I'm reading things, I ask did the person have illnesses? Did the person have disabilities? It occurs to me to ask that question.
Mm-hmm.
Many other people, it doesn't occur to them to ask that question. That's not what they're looking at a scholastic logician or the editors of the encyclopedia for. And so I notice it and they don't. That is not a bad bias, right? It's actually a productive bias, but because I have my point of view, I ask certain questions. And I noticed that this is where the act of teaching is one of the things from which one learns the most. I noticed that my students, when doing a senior thesis, would say, oh, I really love when I find 19th century sources because they're honest about their biases and they let their biases be front and center and on their sleeves, and I can tell exactly what their biases are. But then when I read things from the mid to late 20th century, everyone is trying to put on this mask of objectivity and erase the speaker, erase the actual historian, and pretend that there is no point of view. And it makes it much harder to spot what the biases are. So to these students, as they're reading, they have to be much more wary and uncertain when they're dealing with the histories where the historian is erased than when the historian is present and they feel like they therefore know where they stand and what new questions to ask. And I wanted to write something which would be modern and careful and trying not to be biased the way a 19th century person is, but in which I would remove the mask and let the historian be present and have that chapter called Why Does Ada Palmer Start Studying the Renaissance, and point out moments where people debate X and I know I've been persuaded to side A. But here's also the evidence for side B, so that the historian is present, because history is a constant invention and a constant craft. Sometimes historians will publish new findings and there will be people who object and say, you're rewriting history. We say, yes, that's what you hired us to do. That's our job. We're historians. We're supposed to rewrite history. You're not angry at the physicists when they rewrite physics, but somehow you're angry at the historians when we write history. But that is our job. We're supposed to be re-examining and questioning it and inventing it, because all of these things, names, periods, points when we draw a line and say this is the end of era A and the beginning of era B, are human categorizations, and we need to debate them in exactly the same way that biologists debate, are these two species of giraffe or are they two subspecies within one type of giraffe? How do we, differentiate these things in our constantly changing taxonomy? In the same way that the Brontosaurus didn't exist for a while and then did again. Sometimes dark ages don't exist and then do again and then don't. And we come up with these and then we question them when we should be questioning them. I felt it was extra appropriate to write this particular history removing the mask, though I think it would enrich any history to have the point of view of knowing and meeting the historian who's guiding you through it, because it's about the invention of history. It's about the past people before me who invented the Renaissance. Petrarch invented it. Bruni, Leonardo Bruni, who wrote the first history book that formally divided history into ancient, middle, and present, he invented it. Other figures over the course of the Renaissance reinvented it. Machiavelli reinvented it. The 18th and 19th century people who appropriated ideas of Golden Age and popularized the word Renaissance reinvent it. The 20th century people, my own dissertation advisor, he reinvented it. His dissertation advisor invented it. I'm part of a genealogy of inventing the Renaissance. And I therefore should be as present in the book as Bruni and Christeller, my dissertation advisor's advisor, and all of the other links in that long chain. If I pretend somehow that I'm outside it, there is a disingenuousness to that pretense.
Yeah, and I think that kind of a position, open, vulnerable position of a historian, does service to the reader. Unfortunately, it's extremely rare, if not almost entirely unique. I love history. I study all kinds of history all the time. This is extremely rare, almost unique. What you've done, of how vulnerable and open you have come clean with your background and positioning and how you got to where you were, almost never happens. Because people like to be impartial and remove themselves out of the equation, which of course is impossible, but they still believe that they've done so simply if they never talk about themselves and whatever. But let's specific make this specific to Petrarch, because he had an agenda.
Yeah.
And, your key point was that he invented the idea of the Dark Ages, but I'm trying to understand, or help us understand, what kind of problem was he trying to solve by positioning the preceding period as the Dark Ages? I mean, it serves me well when I'm arguing with my mother-in-law, and when I want to be particularly nasty back and say, okay, the time when the church was the most powerful is commonly referred as the Dark Ages, and we don't want to return there, do we? Right? So that's my kind of sinful son-in-law. But and I have an agenda, obviously, when I'm answering that. What was Petrarch's problem that he was trying to solve by creating this?
So Petrarch absolutely believes himself to be in the dark part. Sometimes when one is discussing a Renaissance, one believes one is in it. And 2 generations later, you have Renaissance figures who say, and we've started having a Renaissance and now everything is better. And I am writing this epic poem about my boss and how great he is and how he has brought a golden age to Milan, or whatever it is, right? As you write your epic poem, dedicating it to the Duke about how great the Duke is, hoping that the Duke will pay you. But Petrarch is earlier than that, and he describes we are in an age of ash and shadow, because Petrarch comes from Florence, and Florence within Italy. He cares very deeply both about Florence and about Italy. Many people ask the important question, is there a concept of Italy as a nation at this point? Is there a concept of Italian nationalism? Some point to Petrarch as the first articulation of Italian nationalism. My answer to that is no. He's thinking of Italy as a region in the same way that Europeans think about Europe. And within that, he is Florentine, and there is a Florentine identity, and his patriotism is Florentine, but there is a solidarity to him of the Italian peoples that if they can ally, they will strengthen each other and be able to guard each other against outside forces by having a shared background while still being fully separate peoples and nations who can loathe each other and have enmities and histories with each other. So Europe in the modern day is a very good comparison of the way he is thinking about Italian identity and then his own Florentine identity. But in Petrarch's moment, Italy is in a state of extreme weakness. The papacy has been carried off from Rome to France, taking with it the vast income stream that pilgrims to Rome brought, and that ambassadors going to visit the Pope in Rome brought, and that political power's presence brought, bringing poverty to many areas in Italy. All of the different city-states in Italy hate each other, and they hate their neighbors. And for centuries, they've been living in the plot of Romeo and Juliet, in which you have 2 houses, both alike in dignity, each trying to be the strongest within the city, and they fight and they care about each other's honor far more than they care about the good of Verona. And if Verona's streets have to run with blood 3 times during one act of the play for the honor of the family, that will happen. And what happens in the real version of this feud is that eventually one of these 2 families will triumph. All right, let's imagine the version of Romeo and Juliet in which Romeo and Juliet don't meet. Juliet goes ahead and marries County Paris. That extremely important marriage alliance makes the Capulets firmly more powerful than the Montagues. They wipe out the Montagues. Now the Capulets win. They control this city. Then the city next door becomes the enemy, and the feud reproduces itself as city against neighbor rather than family against family within city. But this bloodshed has been going on for ages. The brilliant Renaissance historian Guido Ruggiero calls the Guelph Ghibelline feud Italy's 300-year war. And that's only the first 300 years of it, and its aftermath goes on for another 2 centuries. We can easily call it Italy's 500-year war. That is happening. Meanwhile, in order to fight these wars, the small, isolated city-states of Italy, which cannot muster large armies, are hiring mercenary armies, bringing mercenaries from outside Italy bringing in German mercenaries and Swiss mercenaries and mercenaries from Iberia, speaking all the different Iberian languages, who are therefore around in Italy, spending money, looting things, getting together with women, siring children, teaching kids pub songs. So Petrarch is in an Italy in which the economy is poor, there is a lot of poverty, there's widespread warfare. Every spring you decide what the war season will be, then you fight wars all summer, and then in winter the wars quiet down. During winter you debate what the next war season will be, then the wars start up again. And you walk past pubs and kids are singing French and German pub songs, and they're not speaking their native tongue. And these city-states are extremely vulnerable because they're really, really rich. Because banking has come in as of the 1100s to 1200s. That banking means that literal piles of gold are assembling in the basements of these wealthy merchants. Italy is the economic breadbasket of Europe. It's the center of the biggest industries, big olive oil, which is used for industry as well as fuel oil all over Europe, as well as cooking, big wool, which is the equivalent of big auto in terms of being the giant industry where people spend $50,000 on an outfit rather than on a car because of the amount of manual labor that goes into the production of cloth. Both of these are centered in Italy. Parchment and paper production. Italy has 3 of the 5 highest population cities in all of Europe. And most of the great wealth capitals. But unlike Paris, which is defended by armies levied from all of France, somewhere like Florence only has its immediate vicinity to levy an army. It cannot muster an army capable of defending it against large armies if large armies come over the Alps.
Yeah. It's kind of like
So
Athens.
if you're a king, right, if you're a king and you want to cover yourself in glory by conquering and looting something and having your armies come home rich, Italy is the correct answer. And you can go in there and all the cities will betray each other and their neighbors will help you loot the ones you want to loot, making it easy, and no one will come defend them, and they have more money in their basements, smaller armies, and then you go home rich. So Italy is the place to go to have wars. No matter who you are in Europe, Italy is the place to have wars. In fact, there's a set of wars that we call the Italian Wars that are waged between the 1480s, 1490s, and 15 teens. That term, the Italian Wars, is a French term for these wars. And it's a nostalgia term that France develops during the French Wars of Religion for talking nostalgically about, oh, remember back when we fought our wars in Italy and it was warm and the food was good and there was so much agriculture we didn't have to carry food around for our armies, we could just loot it from the countryside, and we got to stop having wars every winter to rest and then keep going, and we were devastating someone else's cities, not our own. Italy, man, the Italian Wars, those were the good old wars. You do not want to be the place that everyone else wants to have its wars. And it's useful to remember that there's only one patch of extended peace in all of Italian history. That's under the good gay emperors, Trajan, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius, right? Other than that, there has been constant warfare within the peninsula in all of recorded history. So with brief patches of peace. So Petrarch, therefore, sees his homeland of Florence and his larger solidarity world of the Italian peninsula as dying. Covered with self-inflicted wounds, surrounded by predatory enemies. The culture is being swallowed up from within by foreigners, in his opinion, while the economy is being drained away, and Italy is stabbing itself every time it stabs its neighbors. So this is the age of ash and shadow. And in contrast, he reads about antiquity. He reads about when Italy was united as the heart of the Roman Empire, when it conquered all of these greater transalpine powers that are so scary, when Rome ruled France and Rome ruled Iberia and Italy was Rome, and Rome could do all of these things, and a young woman carrying a bag of gold could walk untroubled on safe roads from the northern coast of France all the way to Turkey, right? That is impossibly amazing to imagine. There were no pirates on the seas and no bandits on the road, right? This is the Pax Romana is the only
that road goes right through my hometown, by the way. It's called Via Diagonalis.
Yeah, those roads are still there. Again, Roman engineering is where our minds go, right? We think about the aqueducts and the Colosseum and the massive engineering projects. When we think of what comes back in the Renaissance, we think about technology and art. But what they wanted was statecraft. What they wanted was the peace and law and order that meant there were no pirates on the seas, right? The Pax Romana is the only time, or the Roman Empire is the only time there weren't pirates in the Mediterranean. There are pirates in the Mediterranean now. We have not matched this degree of stability, security, and rule of law. And so reading about that, to us, when we say ancient Rome, we're thinking of, Showtime and HBO series where people have a lot of orgies wearing exciting outfits and Cleopatra is there, right? That's not what Petrarch is thinking of. Petrarch is thinking of Trajan. He's thinking of law and order and peace and this impossible dream of safety on the roads, right? Petrarch lived through the Black Death and he lost everybody in the Black Death, friend after friend after friend. His letters are absolutely heartbreaking. They had just bought a villa on a hill where he and a bunch of his nerdy Cicero loving friends were going to go live in an academic commune and read Cicero all day, and it was going to be this wonderful scholar's paradise, and they all die. And after the worst of the big outbreak is over and Petrarch has lost everyone around him, he gets a letter confirming that two of his friends, not close friends, but people he knew, at least who knew his other friends, are alive. And they're on the far side of the mountains, but they're going to come visit him and they're going to, meet up and discuss the good old days and mourn their friends collectively. And the two are attacked by bandits on the road. And one of them is killed and the other is desperately wounded and barely survives and is missing for a year, during which Petrarch doesn't know he's alive or dead. So no bandits on the road is a very immediate, intimate, lived daily problem in a way that's harder for us to wrap our heads around. It's easy for us to think of bandits as something fun that appear in an adventuresome movie or video game. No. So that's what Petrarch means by an age of ash and shadow and by a golden age. And he says, if we read the ancients, if we reconstruct the library that raised Cicero and raised Seneca and raised Trajan, if we educate our next generation of rulers on the education that raised these incredibly competent ancient Roman rulers, maybe they will rule well. Maybe they will bring law and order back. Maybe they will figure out the secrets of statecraft that will give us what we really want, which is peace.
Well, that's so fascinating. And unfortunately, those animosities are present of hating your neighbor are present in Italy to this day. So my wife is 100% Italian. So we were watching this documentary. It's a food documentary about tracing the protagonist's family roots through food and finding his family's place of origin. So all he remembered is that his great-grandmother used to cook this tortelli dish, very special tortelli dish. So he goes to a place in Italy, in a very famous restaurant where he thinks is the right place. And he tells the chef, can you please cook this tortelli dish for me? And the guy gets utterly outraged and says, tortelli are only cooked by the peasants in the village next door. In here, we only cook tortellini, and that's the only way it should be.
Yeah. Last time I was in Florence, I went to buy fish at a fishmonger, and we were discussing art, and I mentioned Pisa. And I had to listen to a 15-minute rant about how much he loathes Pisa and how his nephew went to school in Pisa. They had to go there for the graduation, and it was mortifying and horrible to have to set foot in Pisa. And it's exactly the same feud that Pisa and Florence have had since the days of Machiavelli and well before, these animosities. But Italy and around it Europe have managed to collaborate. They've managed the thing that Petrarch really hoped could happen, which was solidarity, collaboration, and realizing that divided we fall.
Yeah,
right?
And I mean, for the outsider, the difference between tortelli and tortellini could be absolutely invisible, but over there, it's fundamental to one's identity, apparently. So let's see how in the narratives of the Dark Age and the Golden Age gets history weaponized in the service of a certain I don't want to say narrative again because it's tautological, but let's say purpose.
Well, it'll be in service of a variety of different things.
Yeah.
It'll be in service of something that the speaker is attempting to advance.
Right.
So to give the easiest examples, we'll jump into the late 19th and 20th century. But once we agree that there is such a thing as a Renaissance, that it did happen, and that, you know, on the grand tour in the 18th century, to be an educated gentleman or lady, you must visit these art museums and you must bring back replicas of both Italian and ancient Roman stuff from the grand tour. And to be educated is to read the poetry of Petrarch, as well as reading the ancients and all of this. And we agree that there was a Renaissance and that it was good, and there was a Middle Ages and there was bad. We then get to the 19th and 20th centuries when we're thinking more strategically and sort of social sciencey and nitty gritty and utilitarianly. How can we achieve this? How did it happen? And we ask the question, what caused the Renaissance? We have a series of moments when a historian will do research and suggest X is the factor that happened and helped cause the Renaissance. And the scholar will be careful and methodical and not overstate it. And they will say this contributed. But when you write the short journalistic version, it turns into something exploitable for politics. So, for example, economists came in and said, look, in the 1100s and 1200s, there were innovations for the first time in a long time in banking. And there were new ways of lending money at interest and lending money over distance, enabling long-distance trade. There were new forms of insurance. So, you know, the scenario in The Merchant of Venice where if the ship sinks, you're bankrupt doesn't happen because you had insurance on that ship. Sorry, Shakespeare, that plot doesn't actually make any sense in the century you wrote it, but it's fine. Since Venice invented ship insurance before anyone else, they needed it the most. But it's still a fun play, very moving play. And economists come in and say, okay, and the movement of goods and people and materials, allowing specialized industry and exchange of technologies and ideas, all of this is facilitated by banking. Banking is the connective tissue that lets the Renaissance connect up and do all of its stuff, which quickly translates to banking caused the Renaissance. And the Renaissance was the triumph of proto-capitalism. And therefore, capitalism will bring about a new golden age, and capitalism is correct. And communism is like the no good, bad communal Middle Ages. This was so popular during the Cold War. And lots of op-eds and newspaper articles and repetitions of this can happen because it's a zeitgeist moment where everyone is excited by being able to make the claim, capitalism caused the last golden age, therefore we're on our way to the correct future.
And if you are stupid enough to choose communism, you're only going to go back to the Dark Ages. So you'd better be smart and make the right choice, which is us.
Right. But at another moment, a little before, there's the argument that what enables the Renaissance is, actually, let's do one that's about the same time, is that, you know, the Renaissance flourished first in the democracies, or rather the republics. It flourished first in Florence, which is a republic, and Venice, which was a republic, and Siena, which was a republic. And the heart of the Renaissance was the, you know, debates over citizenship and political participation, and Machiavelli writing about the importance of the popolo and enfranchisement of the popolo. And so the Renaissance was facilitated by and defined by proto-democratic thinking, and therefore democracy and Western democracy is obviously the continuation of the Renaissance and what will bring about a golden age, whereas any other form of government like monarchy or collectivism or whatever it is like the bad, no good Dark Ages. And of course, then another historian comes along and is like, the Renaissance happened just as much in Milan and Naples and Rome as it did and they were monarchies, as it did in the republics. But once you have the idea, but the republics are the heart of the Renaissance, you don't want to give up that idea. It's a really nice, desirable idea. And so we get these claims about the Renaissance being golden proves that X thing in the modern world is the correct choice. And notice how all of these arguments are really about modernity. They're not about the Renaissance. They're about what is the correct trajectory forward now. When we choose between A and B, if A caused the Renaissance, A caused the beginning of modernity, A caused the switch away from the Middle Ages, the way people were, from them, toward us, toward the way we live now. The Renaissance as the beginning of modernity. And therefore, whatever it is that caused the Renaissance is the correct trajectory to keep modernity getting more and more modern and better and better. And whatever is the inverse would be what would stagnate and reverse progress. So if the Renaissance Golden Age was enabled by X, X must be the correct path forward. And this is said about democracy, it's said about banking, it's said about nationalism. When people point at Petrarch and Machiavelli and say, look, they're articulating proto-nationalism for the first time, Petrarch calling for a solidarity among Italians. Therefore, nationalism is the correct path forward for the modernity. This is why Renaissance studies is really popular with fascists and with nationalists and with the Nazi regime. They all love Renaissance stuff and Renaissance culture because they're able to use it to argue that nationalism is the defining characteristic of modernity and the right move forward. Because once you decide there was a dark age and a golden age, whatever it is that you think made the inflection and the decision between the two, some people say it's going to be secularization, right? The blossoming of secular thought, humanism pushing back against the superstitious church and freeing the human mind to finally center on real human things instead of being overshadowed by the tyranny of religion. That's another claim about what caused the Renaissance. And the answer is, of course, all of these things were going on at the same time, and they were all interweaving with each other. And there were innovations in banking, and there were innovations in political thought, and there were innovations in statecraft, and there were innovations in radical atheist thought, and there were innovations in theist thought, and there were new wonky cults about projecting your soul out of your body and using it to transcend time. And those were also at the heart of the Renaissance. Lots of different plural strands were going on. But it's so tempting to take one and say, but the real heart of it was this. And therefore, this, which I'm continuing to do in the present, is the correct path forward. And that has made the myth of the Renaissance even more tempting as a golden age than the myth of classical antiquity. Because classical antiquity doesn't have a dark age before it. It has just sort of a vagueness before it. And you can't claim one particular thing was the inflection point. But we're always looking for the inflection point. We love graphs where a flat line suddenly turns into a line that goes up. We all love graphs like that. And antiquity doesn't let you have that graph. But the Renaissance lets you have that graph.
Yeah, I sometimes refer to this as the context effect. It's kind of the framework that we bring to a certain problem or data set within which, with which framework then we decide which is the bad data and which is the good data, which is the useful, which is the non-useful data. And so if our context is banking, as you said, then obviously we would divide the Renaissance with that kind of banking context effect. If it's like democracy or secularization or what have you, republicanism, you would use all of these. But each of them, while containing some truth, obviously comes at the cost of marginalizing, if not making all the other ones invisible, and therefore it impoverishes our point of view. So all of these things, I've benefited so much from you and your book in that sense, because, I was kind of a, maybe not the worst example, but pretty kind of traditionalist in my sort of self-serving view of the Renaissance, if you will. And you, for example, one way of you undermining this is showing that life expectancy actually fell tremendously during parts of the Renaissance. How does that effect alone destabilize the popular Golden Age story?
Yeah, and so the statistic is throughout the European Middle Ages, the average life expectancy for a few hundred years was about 35. That, of course, is very low. It does include infant mortality, so many of those deaths are very early, but it averages out to 35. And it plummets in the Renaissance to, in Florence, the average life expectancy goes as low as 18.
Wow.
And in other areas, it'll be more like 20 or 22. What's causing the change is progress, which is not the answer we want. but people are moving around more. The roads are being used, trade is increasing, all of that banking is coming in and causing stimulus. When the trade routes move, people move, diseases move, and epidemics break out more often. If we break down the demographics, the majority of increased deaths are between the ages of 5 and 12. It's kids who survived the really sensitive infancy. Infant mortality remains the same in the two periods, but kids who survive but then get the pox or fevers of various sorts that are moving around Europe, or the Black Death once it arrives, which remains endemic and comes back all the time.
Malaria seems to have been a common cause of death in
malaria
Italy.
very
like
much.
Dante died of malaria and so many other.
Yeah. And malaria thrives more when the population is denser and there are more people and cows there to support the population of mosquitoes transmitting it, right? And when larger populations crowd near swampy areas, which happens in the period. So disease deaths increase and war deaths increase because the technology got better, so the wars got bigger, and the states got more centralized, so the budgets are larger, so the armies are bigger. As power is consolidated, a larger army can knock down city walls and have more civilian casualties. So it's technology and trade increasing, marks, we would say, of progress and thriving, that cause the life expectancy to go down, which raises this very important question. When we say golden age, what do we mean? Do we mean an age that is nice to live in? Or do we mean an era that laid golden eggs that we in the future look back on and admire? Because the Renaissance is absolutely an era that laid golden eggs. And we have Machiavelli's Prince, and we have Dante's Commedia, and we have all of these Renaissance artwork masterpieces and architectural monuments that we admire. It laid golden eggs. But to live through it felt like precariousness and apocalypse a lot of the time.
I find myself fighting that losing argument often in conversations when we discuss the Industrial Revolution with many people.
Right.
I'm trying to put forward the claim that it's been a horrible period to live through, especially in the hotbed of the Industrial Revolution in most of the places, like, not just London, but even Edinburgh and all the other places in the United Kingdom. And people just don't even want to hear that. They just give me that modern...
Cities became where the rural population goes to die. And population increases in the countryside. There isn't enough work. People move into the cities and then die in the cities because the sanitation and the pollution were horrific and the working conditions had no safety. And it was an appalling time to be alive, the Industrial Revolution. And a good way to think about both of these is that you have a shorter, more painful life, but you have nicer clothes. Right? That's the balance, right? You have more consumer goods. You have whatever the industry is producing, but you live a shorter time with more grief, more stress, more fear, more violence, and more pain.
And more work for a longer time than ever, starting at an earlier age than ever.
Well, that's true of the Industrial Revolution, though that one is not true in the Italian Renaissance, where at least within Florence, we have these amazingly short labor, that labor was paid well enough that Renaissance Florentine day workers usually worked 3 days a week and then took 5 days off because they'd earned enough to live on in 3 days a week, and spent the other times having fun and looking at art. Sounds pretty good if you don't factor dying of the Black Death all the time.
Wow.
But yeah,
that's another fascinating detail there. But the word massacre entered our language, I think, during that period, during the Renaissance.
The word massacre entered our period during the Reformation Wars of Religion.
Oh, yeah. Okay. That makes more sense.
So immediate aftermath, we can say it's the Renaissance's fault. But the word massacre enters not from the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, but shortly before that, from the religious war massacres of Catholics on Protestants, because it was a new and unusual thing for an entering military force to then want to wipe out a whole population visibly within towns and cities within Europe that it was observing.
Right.
So massacre was entered our language then.
So it will be more French than Italian then in that case.
Yeah. Yeah. And so indeed, I talked about the Italian wars as a nostalgia word, right? Nostalgia for when wars were wars, not massacres.
Right.
Nostalgia for days of chivalry instead of days of massacre is what that nostalgia is. And yet the days of chivalry, if you lived through them like Machiavelli, felt like the apocalypse.
Yeah. I'm trying to place Don Quixote is
end of Renaissance.
End of Renaissance, yeah, because it's kind of, is it sort of like the humanist reaction or the Enlightenment?
Well, it's before the threshold of enlightenment in most of our metrics, but it's looking back on both the scholastics and the humanisti as old and well established now, and also on chivalry and courtly culture and all of these different competing and thriving metrics for arguing for what is valuable and what one should do and how one should conduct one's life and what one should value. And I think important there is to remember that fame often comes from having a rival to argue with, right? It's not so-and-so wrote a great book, but it's so-and-so wrote a refutation of so-and-so's book, and now they're bickering with each other. And it's easy for us to imagine that humanisti and humanism replaced scholasticism. But there were more scholastic books written in the Renaissance after the arrival of the humanisti than before. There were more scholastic classrooms after than before. Scholasticism and humanism, we have to be careful with that word, thrived side by side and thrived from debating with each other and from professors having famous feuds and from children going to school and choosing, do I want to have Professor A in this mode or Professor B in this other mode? We have to see them as symbiotic. And neither would be as famous or as meaty or have its superstars if the others weren't there being argued with. People often ask the question, after the printing press develops, when do people stop writing manuscripts? To which the correct answer is, how many blank books were for sale in the last Barnes & Noble you went into? Right? We're producing more manuscripts now than we produced in the manuscript period. We're using them for different things. We're using them only for personal and specific functions when you make a unique object or a first draft, right? But we're still producing masses of manuscripts.
Yeah.
And people say the same about the ebook. Many people assume that the production of print books started declining when the ebook came in, but the production of print books kept going up and up and up and up and up, and is still very, very high. I think it may be slightly down this year from before because of post-COVID industrial shortages of paper, causing an effect that's making more books, but barely down. We're still near maximum of the number of books humanity has ever produced, ever, because literacy is up, population is up, demand for paper books and demand for ebooks, they thrive side by side. Everybody loves having a beautiful bookcase, right? Humanism and scholasticism, and in the Enlightenment, new Enlightenment things, all of these things thrive by being competitors. And we confuse ourselves when we imagine that a technology displaces a previous technology as opposed to joining that previous technology. And in this sense, I'm using the word technology also in the sense of intellectual technology. I know people don't use the term intellectual technology all that much, but I think we really should. By intellectual technology, I mean an idea that someone comes up with it, it then multiplies, it has new approaches, it disseminates the same way a physical technology disseminates. Once it's been invented, the cat can't go back in the bag. It's an idea structure that is useful for doing and achieving other things. The scientific method is an intellectual technology. And when it arrives in a society, it disseminates and it changes the way things work within that society. I would say that the pro-rhetoric arguments of the humanisti and their new ways of using material are another intellectual technology that arrives at a time, disseminates, and then is used alongside scholasticism, which is an earlier intellectual technology.
Yeah, and those are important things which we are going to come back to towards the end of our conversation. But your point here, as you make in the book very well, is actually the idea that fights make fame. And
Mm,
so conflict itself is a very important mechanism of explaining or understanding uh, much of the stuff that was happening during the Renaissance, whether culturally, artistically, intellectually, religiously, politically, militarily, technologically. In all of those
mm,
ways, there's like all these different fractions that were fighting with all these other different fractions. And
yeah.
we understand what emerged as a kind of a concoction of all of these things happening simultaneously. At least that was my lesson. But let me zoom in on one specific individual that we've mentioned already, because he's crucial. And in some
Mm,
ways, there may be, I think, well, he would be the number one. Machiavelli would be the number one individual, perhaps associated, and correct me if I'm wrong, with the Renaissance. And perhaps the second one, which for some people started the whole thing, which you kind of you have a different view, but Dante may be another one.
yeah. I mean, lots of people argue about, is Dante medieval or is Dante Renaissance, but we certainly associate them. I mean, the number one names people will give you if you say Renaissance are Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo,
Yes,
and then
yes,
Machiavelli.
yes,
Uh,
correct, yes. Culturally, because they're the more famous, but like I'm from a
yeah,
political philosophy background, and for me, the
mm,
Prince
yeah,
was like one of the things defining that whole era. So we all had to study it in politics
mm,
obsessively and stuff. So yes, Leonardo and Michelangelo, 100%. And we're going to come back to them in a second. But so what does Machiavelli's life, rather than just the book that he's famous for, The Prince, reveal to us about the Renaissance?
Machiavelli is a figure I got to know best through reading his personal letters, which I read in great detail before I had studied his political writings in detail, which is the opposite of the order in which most people approach him, and I think helped me get to know him in a different
It's a
way.
much better way. Let me agree with you 100%. You explain in your book all the work you have to do with the papal re-elections, gamification, reenactment process
Mm,
to set the stage and the frame and the context within which one can properly read uh, Machiavelli. I never had that luxury. Unfortunately, I never had you as my prof. So I started totally backwards, and that totally skewed, if it didn't poison, my perception of Machiavelli.
yeah. When you get to know him through the intimate um, window of his letters, where you get to see Machiavelli scared, and Machiavelli fretful, and Machiavelli in love, and Machiavelli giving sex advice to his friends, and Machiavelli joking, and Machiavelli terrified. You get to know Machiavelli as one of the most committed and deeply moving patriots that I have ever run across in the historical record. He is someone who, as soon as he started working, worked for his government, a government he loved and passionately strove to defend, even though he himself was not even a full and fully enfranchised citizen. Florence's complex system for determining who can and can't participate in government excluded you from government, even if you were from a good family, if your family was deeply in debt. And his grandfather had old unpaid tax debt, which meant that the family was considered untrustworthy because they could be manipulated via that debt. And so he was excluded from directly holding office. So he was a civil servant. And he worked away in the dusty offices in the Palazzo Vecchio and as an ambassador, in which his job was to go be at the right hand of incredibly powerful, terrifying princes and figure out how to persuade them not to attack his incredibly vulnerable and desirable to conquer homeland. Florence was the richest and most friendless city.
The crown in the jewel.
Available. Yeah, it had the major centers of banking and
the
wool
jewel in
production.
the crown, sorry.
Yeah, it was so lootable. And it had very, very few allies, none nearby. There was Bologna on the far side of the mountains, but basically no one else would have come to help this city. It was sometimes a little friendly with Milan, and they tried. And if you're a king, it's the right target, particularly because it also had a horrible reputation as the center of corruption and sodomy in Europe. And the verb to Florentine was the verb for anal sex in 6 different European languages. And in the laws of France, you could be charged with sodomy on the grounds that you had ever visited Florence even once in your life. That was considered enough evidence that you were clearly a sodomite in French law. So
Wow.
this is this pathetic. Also, there's no political class in Florence of the traditional sense, because Florence's republic was not a normal, sensible, aristocratic republic where there were senatorial families who were in the Senate, like in the Swiss Diet, or in Siena, or in Venice, or in ancient Rome. But they had, in order to try to preserve the republic against a tyrant taking it over, noticed that the tyrants usually came from noble families, so they executed all the noble families, and they cut their heads off, and they put them on spikes, and they raked salt into the earth where their houses used to be. And they made a merchant republic, which was ruled only by the merchant class, guild members, business owners. But this is a world in which to be a ambassador, to be a part of the political world, you had to have noble blood in your veins, or you were no one. There's nobody in this city of sufficient rank to actually be an envoy and talk to neighboring powers. When Florence negotiated its big wool trade deal with England, and England was a big wool producer, Florence would process the wool into high quality finished cloth. That deal had to be negotiated by the King of England sending a servant to talk to a merchant, to have him send a servant to go down to the docks to see if there were any exiled Florentines hanging around, because there are no Florentines of rank allowed to talk to a king. And when they even want to have a police, they have to hire a foreign nobleman to come to Florence to command their own police, because you're not going to answer if you're arrested in the name of some commoner. Obviously, in this period, that would be madness. The police are only going to follow a nobleman. So they had to hire a nobleman, the podesta. He came to Florence for 1 year at a time and enforced the law. And then at the end of the year, they paid him handsomely. They escorted him to the gates. They thanked him for his service, and they banished him from Florence on pain of death, so that he couldn't use his year in office to try to seize power locally. So there's no marriage alliances between Florence and anywhere else. They're all the rank of everybody's valet, not of everybody from the point of view of a political world. And so if you want to sack something, do you want to sack the filthy hive of scum and villainy that has no allies and nobody worth mentioning living there, that has masses of gold in the basement? Or do you want to sack anywhere else, right? There is a wrong answer to this question. You want to go for Florence. And so Machiavelli has the job, go be at the side of and whisper in the ear of these kings and get them to believe that they shouldn't sack Florence, right? Go to France, and we're going to be really pro-French and give them lots of favorable trade deals and lend them enormous amounts of money for their wars against England, so that they will want Florence to keep being the goose that lays golden eggs. Go stand at the side of Cesare Borgia and offer him whatever you have to. Offer him troops, offer him money, offer to betray every ally we ever had, so long as he will keep pushing Florence to the end of his conquest list and give us the dreadful boon of Polyphemus, I like you, I'll eat you last. That is Machiavelli's job. And it means that he is in the eye of the hurricane of power, watching the storms as he is trying to direct them away from his home city. And he witnesses the most terrifying massacres and battles of the Italian wars. And then eventually his home city suffers a complex tumult, which we might end up talking about, but I'm going to skip over its complexities for the moment. And power changes hands, and since he was high in the earlier regime, the new version of the Republic ends up first arresting and torturing and then banishing him. And when you're banished like that, and you're a statesman with political and military experience, and a well-established historian with famous publications, he wrote a very popular comic play, as well as a history of Florence. The expectation is that he will go work for someone else. He will have job offers from powerful cardinals in Rome who saw him there as an envoy. He would have job offers from former allies in Milan and France. Machiavelli doesn't take them. When Florence banishes Machiavelli and they say, stay put in this small farming village outside the city, and we will perhaps reconsider and let you come home, or you can run off and work for someone else and be banished for life, he faithfully stays, because Machiavelli only works for Florence. He will not serve any other polity. He will only serve Florence. And so he waits and he rots, and he writes letters advising his friends who are still in the political world on how to do things. And he writes the prince his manual on how to survive in a dire political world. And he sends it to the very conquerors who tortured and banished him, saying, I will not share this recipe book of successful statecraft with any power but Florence. I will come and work for you if you bring me back, or I will sit in the countryside and rot, but I only serve my country. And I will not let this is why he doesn't publish it. He circulates it very, very quietly. A big reason, he only wants his allies and his city's allies to have the prince, because he is a faithful servant of the Florentine people. And in the prince and in the discourses, he argues over and over, anything is better than civil war and risk of conquest. And when he writes about how the prince can do desperate things and sinister things to stay in power, he says, because if the prince loses power, if there is a revolution, if there is a regime change, the streets will run with blood. And when there has been one regime change, then there will be another, because some other family will come and want to take power, or because some outside power will say, aha, a weak, newly planted regime, I can displace it and conquer it. He has watched cities like Bologna, Florence's old ally, which they betrayed to protect themselves, Florence's old ally, change hands 6 times, each time in a bloody war, after the first regime change broke the stability and legitimacy of what has been there. And he has seen regime change in Florence. He has seen Florence's streets run with blood. And he urges, yes, you should do whatever you need to do to stay in power, because even life under a tyrant, he says, is better than war and then life under another tyrant, which is the outcome if the tyrant is displaced. We always quote it, the ends justify the means, without remembering that this is Machiavelli. The end is the survival of the nation and the survival of its people. And to survive, that justifies, in his view, any means necessary to ensure the survival of the people. It isn't a blanket, the ends justify the means always. The ends justify the means when the ends are survival and the stakes are existential.
Yeah, and in his case, it was existential, both personally and for his beloved city-state.
In the last year of his life, they, against his advice, did have the revolution and kick out the new regime and invited him home. And his son was killed in the subsequent siege when the expelled tyrants came back. Exactly what Machiavelli warned would happen happened. The regime change immediately triggered one bloody battle, and then a new siege and another bloody battle, and his son Ludovico died in it.
Yeah, that's it's horrible to foresee this and to be unable to prevent it. It has this kind of Shakespearean tragedy in it, if you will.
Yep. Friends in letters call him a Cassandra.
Right. Wow. Well, Cassandra was cursed by, was it Apollo?
Apollo.
Whom she spurned, and she was cursed to predict only true things, but that no one would ever believe her. How horrible that is.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. One of the things Machiavelli spent a lot of his life urging was that Florence needed an army consisting of citizens, not mercenaries. that mercenaries will always change sides and flee if it looks like they're going to actually be killed, because money isn't worth dying for. You don't get to enjoy the money. That if Florence wanted to have a reliable army, it needed a citizen militia. And we all agree now that we need a citizen militia. That's now the main structure for the way we think about armies from French Revolution forward. But no one ever trusted him. They thought he was trying to raise a private army to take over the city. We have all these letters from friends saying, Machiavelli, you're right. We would thrive better if we had a citizen militia, but no one will ever believe you.
Yeah, so I hope people understand a lot better where he's coming from when he says the ends justify the means, or when some prince does good deeds that lead to a terrible, poor result. Those deeds should not be imitated. And when we have another prince who is a horrible person, who does horrible acts, but they end up being for the better of the community, those deeds should be imitated.
It's the birth of utilitarianism. In fire and war. But it's also, and here I want to jump back historically, one thing we haven't talked about yet is how long the Renaissance was. Because we talk about it as one era, right? But it's really long. And decade by decade, each decade in lived experience is different. We have this myth that eras are shorter now and that time is moving faster. We kind of propagate this myth via sort of Hollywood and settings, right? If you think about a historical, it'll have a setting, and the Roaring Twenties is a setting, and World War II is a setting, and ancient Rome is one setting, and the Renaissance is one setting, and the Middle Ages is maybe two settings because there's like Vikings and there's knights. So those are basically two settings, right? And if you go to a TV producer and you want to pitch a show, and you say, I am pitching this great show about Constantine. And they'll say, well, actually, it's a great pitch, but we're doing a show about Nero, and it's the same. We don't want to do two Romans. And you're like, but those are centuries apart. And they're like, yeah, but they're the same setting. But if you go and pitch a show about the Roaring Twenties, and they're doing a show about World War I, they'll say, yeah, Roaring Twenties, World War I, totally different eras, right? We have this interesting myth that somehow an era used to be centuries, and now it's decades. And you get this in the video games from which we learn so much of our history. Video games like Civ, which is by and large the largest teacher of history in our civilization right now. And, bar none, I mean, rivaled by Europa Universalis, but basically Civ is the way most people learn to think about history.
What is Civ? Excuse my ignorance.
Civilization, it's a video game
the
where
Civilization.
you have...
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, Civilization, right? And in the beginning, one turn is about a century, and then a turn is 50 years, and then a turn is a decade, and by the time you get to the modern day, a turn is a month, making the argument somehow that as much history happens in a month now as happened in a century ages ago. But when you read letters from the Renaissance, people in the 1490s are totally waxing nostalgic about the 1420s, and people in 1525 and 1526 are like, oh my God, everything went so bad post 1500. Everything was so much better in the 1490s, and even those were bad compared to the 1480s. Why can't we go back? And it's moving just as dynamically as now. So we talk about the Renaissance as one era, but from Petrarch articulating his call for Italian solidarity to Machiavelli articulating his call for Italian solidarity is the same amount of time from the education of young Napoleon to Yuri Gagarin's spaceflight. And it's only halfway through Renaissance because Shakespeare's grandparents are alive, but Shakespeare hasn't been born yet. It's a really long period of time, and it has subcomponents and good moments and bad moments just as ours do, and we have to kind of zoom in to realize how complicated history is and that it's always been very dynamic and moving with many different parts. So Petrarch is a Napoleon amount of time before Machiavelli. And Petrarch is the one who says, if we reconstruct the libraries of the ancients, we can raise statesmen who will rule well and who won't, like young Romeo, knife people in the streets and expect to get away with it, right? And then Lord Montague is in front of the prince demanding that Romeo get away with murder with no consequences. Can you imagine Lord Montague saying, actually, no, this was bad for the state. Let's condemn Romeo, right? So Petrarch reads about the Roman Brutus, the ancestor of the one who killed Caesar, the one who, when his sons conspired to take over the state and make him king, when he was consul, he executed his own sons for treason against the state. Can you imagine Lord Montague executing Romeo? No, we just can't. And Petrarch can't. So that's Petrarch's generation. He says, we need young Romeo reading this. The next generation is a generation that tries it, and they tramp across the Alps, and they find the manuscripts, and they voyage east to Constantinople, where learning has never diminished the way it did in impoverished Europe that just couldn't afford to make books when books were very expensive, and libraries diminished because they didn't have access to cheap writing materials like papyrus, which grew in the Middle East but didn't grow in Europe, so libraries were just too expensive. So they gather the manuscripts, and they reconstruct education, and they get ready to raise the next generation of princes like this. And then the third generation are the princes raised on this. And that's the generation that Machiavelli is working for. The first generation that got to grow up with all the classics, right? And they have the Latin and the Greek and the Cicero and the Plato, and it's all back. And Machiavelli loves it and grew up on it, and reads Latin and writes out whole manuscripts, correcting the text as he goes, and studies this material. We have this beautiful letter when he's in exile where he talks about how after his wasted day mucking around in the countryside and going to a pub and getting drunk and so on, he comes home and changes out of the clothes of exile into the court finery that he used to wear when he was an envoy for his city, and attired thus, he enters his library to read and hold commerce with the ancients, right? That's the awe in which he holds Petrarch's project, of which he's a product. And these princes raised on Cicero produce Cesare Borgia and Giuliano della Rovere, and the worst, most murderous, most massacring, most apocalyptic political situation that Italy had seen for not just living memory, but generations. And Machiavelli looks at it and says, okay, it didn't work. We tried it. Petrarch's promise was, if we make these libraries and raise the next generation like this, it'll make a better world. And we tried it, and it failed, and it made a worse political situation. But I don't think the libraries were a waste. I think the libraries are still power. I think the libraries are still the key. We just need to use them differently. And Machiavelli's innovative thought really centers on the use of history, and says we should not, as Petrarch said, use history as a casebook of admirable people to read the biographies of and osmotically absorb their good qualities, that reading about the heroism of Caesar will make you heroic, and reading about the prudence of Marcus Aurelius will make you prudent, and reading about the purity and self-sacrifice of Portia or Lucrezia will make you pure. That didn't work. What we need to do is use casebook history as a casebook of examples of what worked and what didn't, and analyze why, and gather together examples of, here's this kind of battle, it had this outcome, and here was why, and when it had the other outcome, these were the different changes, and use history systematically as a set of examples. In other words, we need political science, and he invents political science because he thinks that the project as it conceived failed, but that the libraries were still full of the power to do what we need to do. And he's making this criticism of the Renaissance in the middle of the Renaissance. So halfway through the Renaissance decides that the Renaissance has failed and that it needs to rethink what it's doing and do it differently. We do stuff like that all the time, right? And here we are in the midst of the computer and technology revolution, and it's been going on for about the amount of time the Petrarch really reading the ancients project had been going on since they first made the libraries. And now we're looking at it and what its consequences are, and asking questions about them, and thinking, has this project gone wrong? Should we be using this technology differently? This is history moving at exactly the same speed that it moved then. It's not moving faster. It's moving at the same speed. We just, in the same way that we like golden ages and dark ages, like to sort of homogenize the past into big blobs and smear away the fact that it had lots of tiny crises and experiments and moonshot projects. Making these libraries by GDP cost Florence more than the moon landing cost the US. these moonshot projects and their aftermaths, and they worked somewhat, but they didn't have quite the impact they wanted, and then they reconsidered them at exactly the same pace that we do. And we delude ourselves when we somehow tell ourselves that the present is special and gets through an era in a decade. We don't get through an era in a decade. We get through an era in the same pace we got through an era in the past. We just admit all the details of our eras. But if Machiavelli were a TV producer, he would totally say that something set in the 1480s is as different from something set in the 1490s as something set during World War II and something set during the Roaring Twenties.
Wow, there's so many things I don't even know which one to grab forward, because there's like so many interesting and important things there that you've touched upon. So I'm struggling a little. Let me see.
Well, I'll add the mini conclusion with that then. There are some people right now who are accelerationists and think that the best thing we can do is deliberately drive ourselves toward an apocalypse, which will create a dark age, because then we will move through that dark age and get to a golden age. The dark ages are generative. That, like burning down the forest, they make the green shoots come back. And the better you know the Renaissance, the more you know, A, it wasn't a golden age, but B, even if there are golden ages and dark ages, let's for a moment imagine that that is somehow true. That dark age is not going to be over in a decade and then we get our golden age right away, which is the way people imagine it, because people think we get through an era in a decade. We don't. It's going to be 2 generations. The accelerationist project would not mean 10 years of hardship. It would mean 50 years of hardship minimum. And if a golden age came out of it, it would be built through the slow, plodding, just desperately hard work of many generations working to undo the damage, exactly the way the Renaissance was done. The Renaissance didn't bloom easily and naturally out of the soil because there were ashes there. The Renaissance was an incredible amount of human collaborative toil. And had there been less damage earlier, had there not been the Black Death, for example, it would have just been better. Burning it down did not make fertility come as a consequence. Danger sometimes caused innovation, in the same way that when you're scared, you take moonshots, and moonshots are generative. Fear, yes. Destruction and actually dismantling systems, no. That just slows down progress. And if you are an accelerationist and want to talk more about it, I mean, read the book, but accelerationism, believing that a dark age will pass quickly and cause a golden age, every historian will tell you that that just isn't true.
Yeah, I'm grateful you're closing that loop. So let's move on to something else which kind of messed up my keynotes. And it's the idea of what humanism is and isn't, and what it resulted in and it didn't.
Yeah.
So you kind of touched upon on that already very generously, but let's, before we go back to that and see how we can make it relevant to today, let's define what it is first. What is humanism actually, and what is it not?
Yeah. So here what we're talking about is a Renaissance intellectual movement, which has a name popular with and that sounds like the modern one we call humanism, often secular humanism. And here is another instance where explaining the 19th century background helps before we get to the earlier bit. But especially in the 19th century and now, major Renaissance figures were claimed as antecedents of the Renaissance, antecedents of modern secular humanism and secular thought. This was done in the late 19th century and in the 20th. And modern secular humanism is generally anti-organized religion, anti-religion, pro-secular thinking, focuses on how much separation of church and state has been a boon to the world, separation of church and state has been a boon to the world, go separation of church and state. Secular thought is cool and awesome, but want to attribute it to the Renaissance. And in the 19th century, read key works of Renaissance literature in a light of seeing secularism in them. Of these, the most celebrated was Giovanni Pico della Mirandola's famous Oration on the Dignity of Man. On the bookshelf over there, you can find Brian Copenhaver's 900-page book proving that the oration isn't an oration and that it isn't about the dignity of man. It's actually a manual on how to turn yourself into an angel and protect your soul outside of time. Because in the 19th century, we were reading certain Renaissance works very out of context, and we did not understand very much about the larger context in which they appeared, mostly because the 19th century had the very powerful nationalistic idea that authentic ideas could only be expressed in one's native tongue, and that anything written in a second language could not possibly be authentic and express the real zeitgeist, the real thoughts, the real essence and spirit of a nation. And therefore, when studying the Renaissance, they ignored everything in Latin and read only the stuff that was in Italian, with very, very, very few exceptions. Some of Pico's work is some of it. But ignoring, therefore, the vast majority of intellectual produce in the Renaissance, which was produced in Latin because it was the exchangeable, universally legible language of scholarship. And we have done a lot of work in the last few decades to get back at the Latin sources that tell us more of what people in the Renaissance were really doing. So, in the Renaissance, this movement, which was in opposition to Scholasticism, developed, that taught the Studia Humanitatis, which was a curriculum based on the Greek and Latin classics that focused on ethics and rhetoric, and wanted to empower the student to use persuasive language and beautiful language to move people to action. If the Scholastic could produce a long, tedious geometric proof that you should be good, similar to how in math class, when it was time to do geometry, we had to learn how to make a tedious 23-step proof that the sides of the triangle that we knew from the first place were equal. Everyone remember that stage in math class, and it's neat, it's objectively interesting, but it's also tedious, and at the end, the conclusion is not very exciting. It is true, and you see it, and you believe it, and you understand it, but it is not very exciting and moving. And they wanted to empower people to have a rich moral education and an ability to persuade, and write a moving pamphlet or a powerful speech persuading people that love of one's country is important, and that one should stand up besides one's fellows and fight for one's country. If we think of Thomas Paine's Common Sense and the incredibly beautiful quotable passages within it that are still on t-shirts and bumper stickers, and that moved so many people to be part of a movement that was so popular that in the days leading up to the US Revolution, there were actually more copies of Common Sense printed than there were citizens living in the colonies. This despite this being nowhere near 100% literate world, because you wanted to have your copy to hold and own while you listen to others read aloud from it, like having a badge of membership in the movement, like having the t-shirt with the political slogan, right? To have Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Those are words that sting and bite. That is the pen that is mightier than swords. And they wanted to teach students to wield the pen that is mightier than swords in the spirit of ethics and peace, to persuade princes to prudent action. And the ideal career for a product of the Studia Humanitatis is to become a tutor to princes, right? To be hired by the Duke to raise the prince and princess, to teach them to be like Hadrian and Trajan and Marcus Aurelius and Julius Caesar. So this was a rival educational movement. Many of its first students were refugees from med school or refugees from law school who hated med school or hated law school, and found that they loved reading Cicero and poetry and discussing ethics. And so it became a tradition that you could educate your kids in, either by hiring a private tutor or by sending them to a university that had humanisti, and was designed to train people who would then serve as secretaries and assistant envoys and tutors to princes. And this was part of Petrarch's sort of project to try to spread humane discourse and persuasion toward prudence and peace and prudent action throughout Italy and Europe in order to increase its stability. it resulted in the educational system from which the modern liberal arts education is now descended, and reading the classics differently. Because, of course, scholastic education was also reading Aristotle and reading Virgil. Everyone had been reading the classics all the way through the Middle Ages. They're reading the classics. It's the backbone of education. Humanisti are about performing the classicism differently and trying to be more classical. And they're connected with the classical revival, which is also a revival in art and architecture. Europe starts building buildings with pediments and columns again. And all of that is about trying to be like ancient Rome and imitate ancient Rome. And if you built a building with a column, with columns and a pediment on the front, that was your way of declaring allegiance to the project of reviving what Rome was and declaring yourself to be a practitioner of this Romanness. So the Humanisti were part of this movement. The heart of this movement was ethics and political success and stability. And when we look at the rhetoric within it and we look for questions of, is there secular stuff in this? The vast, vast, vast majority of it is incredibly Christianly, Catholically pious. And they're invoking Cicero and saying, oh, and he's almost as Christian as Christians. And they're saying, you should read Epictetus. He sounds just like St. Paul. And he was friends with St. Paul, and they fake, letters between Seneca and St. Paul to suck all of this together. And they're encouraging piety, and they're making arguments that ancient Roman religion was real, and that the ancient pagan gods were angels, and that worshiping Apollo is a perfectly Christian thing to do because Apollo is also an angel, so this is fine. And they make a hybrid where they get to have their cake and eat it too by honoring the pagan gods and having the Romans be correct about religion, but Christianity is also correct about religion. It's just ever so slightly more correct about religion, but all the ancient Roman stuff still exists. And within that, there is very little secularizing, except in as much as they care so much about the world, right? The goal is world peace and benefit for people and people living better, rather than the goal being the preparation of the soul for heaven. And the scholastic is much more the preparation of the soul for heaven, how to be a virtuous person, how to know about God so that you can prepare your soul to get to paradise and not inferno when you've died. Scholastic education presumes that studying and honoring God will mean God will bless you and your city will prosper, and then having holy relics will make your city prosper. But it isn't a social engineering, earth-oriented project. And the Humanisti really have an earth-oriented project. This virtue is not just going to get people into heaven. It's going to make earth a better place to be. It's going to make our children happier and living in better places. It's going to help with poverty. It's going to help with stability. And that is a redirection of attention onto an earthly thing.
Well, to me, that's the key point here. That's so I am most interested not so much in the secular part of humanism, which many people nowadays identified with, but with the two things: the ethics, number one, and number two is the shared earthly humanity, our common human nature. And before that, the problem with scholasticism was it St. Thomas who said the whole purpose is basically to prepare your soul for heaven forever. So basically everything you do here today on earth is to get there.
Right.
And that's
none of it matters. The earth is disposable.
Exactly.
The earth is just a temporary place. It's where the eggs are and the caterpillars crawl around.
It's a transition.
But the butterfly, right? The butterfly is the dead human soul in heaven. And we don't care about, after the caterpillars hatch out in the butterfly, what do we do with the contents of the terrarium? We throw them in the garbage. When the earth has finished producing enough human souls to fill heaven, what will God do with the earth? He'll throw it away. It'll be garbage. There is no point in investing in the earth in that worldview. And the Humanisti, it is revolutionary in its focus on earth. Now, Machiavelli attributes this to being closer to Roman religion. Not secularization, but again, moving backwards to a golden age. And he has a very telling passage in his Discorsi, his discourses on Livy, where he talks about republics, where he says one of the reasons Rome thrived is that Roman religion incentivized people taking political, patriotic action, especially the nobility, because Roman um, afterlife beliefs, right? They
The
believed in
ancestors.
ancestor worship, and that you only retain your memories after death to the degree that you are remembered and honored on earth. And if people speak your name, your soul remembers its name.
Right.
And if people forget your name, your ghost will fade away and forget even your name, your very name. So you want to be remembered. And the best possible thing you can therefore do is sacrifice yourself for the state. So you will become a hero. So people will want to have a holiday in your honor and speak your name for ages after. And that is ideal, and that this incentivized the Roman aristocracy to give of themselves and to sacrifice themselves and to put their personal glory, which would ensure their immortality via word fame, above where they put um, the above life, above everything. And then he says Christianity came along and said, all that matters is the internality of your soul. It doesn't matter what is happening with anybody else. It doesn't matter what's happening on earth. You have no reason to help the earth, no reason to sacrifice yourself for the state, no reason to be invested in politics. All you need to be invested in is the state of your own soul. Therefore, he says, Christianity diminished political stability and caused all of these different harms. But, he says, it has the advantage of being true, period, end of paragraph. And that's the only thing he has to say in favor of Christianity, is this one little mandatory sentence. But of course, this is the thing we must all say is true, even though it's sort of political doom. So indeed, he is a more secular and more critical side of what is, for even many of these pious people, a really innovative moment in caring about the collective project of making earth be a good place and valuing not necessarily everybody else, valuing their own cities, but hoping that a solidarity among neighbors and improving, France might be an enemy of Italy a lot of the time and threatening to invade. But if you, an Italian, can be the tutor to the next king of France, maybe you will get him to not be the kind of king who would invade. Again, improving the moral condition of all of the world improves the lived condition of the whole world. That is a humanity-focused, earth-focused project. It is not secular in that it's not anti-religious. They all believe that they are doing this in alignment with a divine project. Well, a few of them don't. There are some atheists in the Renaissance. I'm happy to tell you I found two of them. There they are, being atheists and saying overtly in documents that they don't believe in God. They're there too. But a lot of these guys are very pious and nonetheless very excited by this new project of saving the world. And you have to care about the world and about collective action and the value of improving humanity before you can have secularization. So it's not a secular movement then, but it's an important ancestor of the possibility of later secular movements. And it itself is equally compatible with theism and atheism. It's just also saying it's worthwhile valuing what we build on earth. What we build on earth is important.
Right. So I want to shift our context here a little bit more modern and
Sure.
kind of move forward in time to sort of the relevance of it or the moral lessons today. And that's why the ethics and the shared humanity context or biases are something I'm interested in, because those are kind of my bias. And so let's see how we can unpack that and what's there in it for us today, here, right now. So one thing that you kind of messed up for me was my keynote was very simple, straightforward, and simplistic and powerful. One of my keynotes. And I have a part in it, and I love giving it to like engineers and scientists. So I did two of them to the Danish Engineering Society, and it went really well. And, I talk about Humanitas and Studia Humanitatis and how the point of that project was, in a way, the cultivation of personal character, the cultivation of better people, and while recognizing our shared humanity. So those are the interesting biases and elements to me. And I make the distinction, or I draw the parallels rather, between scholasticism and humanities humanism on the one hand, and humanism being a reaction to scholasticism, and how today we have STEM. And 90% of the money that we invest in our education today in university institutions goes to STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. And the humanities and the arts are always begging there with a diminishing share of the pie, because you see, they're not productive. You can't really patent anything there, and they don't give you a good return on investment dollars, especially in the short run or whatever, just like the engineering department would do, or the medical school, and decoding some DNA or something like that. And so then I make forward the argument that we need a new reformulation of STEM into STEAM, where the arts, would be right in the heart of that project. And much of the problems that we have seen with STEM so far was the simplistic argument I've been successfully making so far, that you totally messed up for me. Thank you for that. Has been because we have lacked the arts and humanities, as part of that project. And so let's go back in time and ask you this. If what I'm saying and what I've argued is actually true, why the hell it went so wrong in the Renaissance, when, people followed Petrarch's guidance, taught the next two generations arts and humanities and the classics and this and that, and they had bloodshed and murder and violence of unprecedented scale, or with poison and murders on the street and sacking cities and you name it, right? So it would appear that, based on what you said, Machiavelli was saying this project failed miserably. And if that's true for that time, maybe my claim today, which is very similar, was very simple, forward like Petrarch, should be a doomed claim. And it means that what I've argued is not just wrong, but maybe even dangerous.
So I hope that toward the end of this answer, I will swing around to Francis Bacon and the birth of the scientific method, which I think is part of the answer. But I think the core, and I'm going to use this set of terms to then redescribe the Renaissance and also redescribe our present. We struggle to, and I'm getting this vocabulary from the brilliant philosopher Alexis Shotwell via her wonderful book Against Purity on ethical living in a compromised world, which I highly recommend. We struggle as a culture to think about extensive goods and extensive evils, as opposed to intensive goods and intensive evils. So an intensive evil is when the harm is caused by one source. There is a bad guy, there is an evil corporation, there is a sinister dark lord, we can defeat him. An extensive evil is when the cause is distributed all over. There are an enormous number of structures within our society which make it difficult for us not to produce plastic trash. And we all produce plastic trash every day, and plastic trash is choking our streams and making microplastics in our bodies and making us all sick. And there is no dark lord we can defeat. It is an extensive evil. Intensive good is a hero, or a technology that saves the day, or a technology that makes us rich. Penicillin is an intensive good. We can identify and recognize penicillin, and it does good, and we all benefit from it. The invention of penicillin was definitely an intensive good, and it won these certain victories.
So today, the singularitarians believe that AI is an intensive good because it's a silver bullet that will solve every single problem that we have, from death to mortality to poverty to climate change to war to justice to discrimination. You name it, everything will be political conflict, everything will be solved by AI. I don't care what it is, because it's so almighty, powerful, all-knowing, and omnipresent that once we have artificial superintelligence, man, we can just watch Netflix and drink beer till forever, because we're never going to die even.
Yeah. And one of the reasons people like it is it's very difficult to think of solutions to extensive evils. We're bad at thinking about extensive evils. We're bad at addressing them. And so the idea that there can be an intensive good that will solve the extensive evils is really tempting. But let's talk about extensive goods, because I think one problem with why we value STEM more than we value the arts and social sciences is that STEM tends to produce identifiable, nameable, intensive goods. It produces an invention which makes us rich. It produces a vaccine which protects us from COVID. It produces a machine, which means we now all have magic devices in our pockets. These are intensive goods, and they are the results of STEM. And the arts and social sciences tend to produce extensive goods, right? Here is a massive study of traffic from which we figure out that if we make this change to the way we organize program the speed of red and green lights, we will save 5 lives a day over the whole globe, spread out in a way that nobody can really see because it's a small diminution in a large statistic. And we can't patent it, and it isn't making anybody rich, and it doesn't have a name. It is an extensive good that was produced by social science analysis. And we talk about the value of teaching young people critical thinking, and that teaching young people critical thinking makes them better citizens and less persuadable by propaganda and better able to make prudent political choices. And all across the world now, a bunch of people have that education and are making those more prudent political choices than they would have if they didn't have that education. And that is an extensive good. But because it's so extensive, we can't measure it. And it's hard to name it. And it's very difficult for us to say, well, if we didn't have this, would the political situation we're in be worse than it is now? Right? So let's then go back to the Renaissance. The effects of Petrarchan education making a bunch of people care very deeply about faithfulness and honesty and peace is that a bunch of people's actions were shaped by this. Meanwhile, many specific trajectories were still on their way. States were centralizing and getting richer, so armies were bigger, so wars were going to be deadlier. Implementation of gunpowder was advancing rapidly. Artillery was getting more effective. Wars were going to be nastier. Wealth was accumulating more. Larger wealth means larger scale investments and more lootable cities. So the incentives behind war were increasing, and cumulative church corruption meant that the Catholic Church and the papacy were getting more and more corrupt over time, getting toward the most corrupt they ever were. And corruption causes all sorts of instabilities and opportunities for exploiting that system. So let's imagine there was no Petrarch project. The wars would still have gotten way worse in the 1490s or slightly earlier because gunpowder and economics and church corruption and centralization of state power were going to make the wars get nastier no matter what. Meanwhile, we have the extensive good that a whole lot of people valued Petrarch's project. This didn't stop those Italian wars from being so bad that they felt like an apocalypse, but they did stop it from being worse. And to give an example, Cesare Borgia's march through Italy conquering things. He faced other rulers. Some of the rulers he faced were figures like Guidobaldo da Montefeltro, who is named by Machiavelli as an example of a prince who really did embody all of the values that Petrarch advanced. And Valentino Cesare Borgia had to invest effort in overcoming and persuading and dealing with those princes. What if that education hadn't been there and he had been able to move through those areas and conquer them faster? That might have been the case. The efforts to marshal resistance against him might have been smaller and slower, in which case, Machiavelli said, frankly, if the campaign had lasted another year, Florence would have been conquered. If the campaign had moved a little faster, Florence would have been conquered. So did Petrarch save Florence? Maybe. Via the extensive good that was the population that was willing to rally.
Wow.
And here I'm going to jump into my papal election simulation, which you already mentioned briefly. But every year I run a very complex simulation of these wars, and we have 107 students, each of them playing a different participant in this political situation. And some of them are very ruthless and selfish and very powerful. And some of them are mighty kings with big armies, eager to use those armies on something. And some of them are idealist followers of Petrarch who want to, get together and enable world peace. And every year they make different, unique combination of alliances and decisions, and they fight a unique, different set of wars. And every time there's a war. Because when you have kings lying around with armies, you want to use it just like you want to fire the gun by the end of the play when the guard is on stage. You want to use your armies. They all have strong incentives for invading each other. And the selfish jerks who want to exploit the corruption of the papacy will exploit the corruption of the papacy, and all that will advance. And the group who follow Petrarch will try to organize for peace. And every year, that group is different in strength because of the particular degree of enthusiasm or passion or rhetorical skill of people in it. And sometimes they're absolutely useless. And we have a terrible war that steamrolls everything. And sometimes they're really effective and they manage to put together a defense coalition that manages to camp itself around Florence and maybe one other city and use the pen that is mightier than swords, plus their solidarity and their persuasion, to reduce the harm and protect a couple of cities against what's happening. And that is a spread out, extensive thing that is there because I'm simulating the Petrarchan project. And does it stop the wars? No. Does it make the wars slightly less bad? Yes. And one problem, I think, with our whole culture is that we focus so much on absolute victories and absolute defeats, and we tell very few stories about partial victories. But all real victories are partial victories. And something which makes a war less bad, saves thousands or tens of thousands or millions of lives and saves the city from burning, that is a victory. Other cities burned, but if it was 5 instead of 8, that's victory. But it's very hard for us to see that because we don't tell stories about partial victory very much. We like stories where at the end we blow up the bad guy's tower and we win. Or tragedies where everybody burns and dies. But we have a very poor vocabulary for talking about partial victory and for recognizing partial victory as victory. One thing that my students do in the simulation every year that I find palpable in this way is in the 1490s, there was an alliance, a naval alliance between England and Portugal. That though the two of them wanted to protect each other and sort of keep France out of the Atlantic, and they had solidarity. And over the course of the simulation, many people will try to put pressure on this alliance and woo one or the other of the two powers into splitting and allying with them for short-term gain against this then sort of 80-year-old alliance. And the alliance is tested to breaking point. But there are really good reasons for these two powers to be allied, and sometimes they break the alliance and they betray each other, and sometimes it sticks together. And after the simulation, it's over. I talk to the two students who control England and Portugal, and I either say, congratulations, or I have bad news for you, because that naval alliance is the oldest treaty in the world. It is still in effect now, and it is the reason Portugal let the Allies use their ports to stage a rival in World War II. And without that treaty, World War II would have lasted at least another 6 months. And the Holocaust would have had another 6 months to consume and consume and consume people. And so congratulations, students who kept that alliance. You helped make World War II 6 months less bad. That is a really powerful partial victory, and is the sort of thing that often that alliance is saved by people pleading with them, be faithful to your promises, stand by your friends, don't be tempted by the bribes of others, put solidarity and the long-term good of your people above the short-term gain of what is in front of you. That is Petrarch's project pleading, right? So we have trouble measuring extensive goods, and the arts and sciences are different. The arts and humanities and social sciences tend to produce extensive goods. But as I often say when talking about COVID, producing the vaccine was the STEM problem. Distribution of the vaccine was the social science problem. Persuading people to take the vaccine and listen to the protocols was the arts and humanities problem. Which of these did we fail? We succeeded at the one that's getting 90% of the funding, and we failed at the two that are starved for funding. But we need those extensive goods to enable the intensive good to do its good. But because it's intensive and easier to see, easier to measure, easier to name, easier to profit by, we struggle to perceive the extensive goods.
Yeah, this is an example I've given myself several times. But the good news for me here is that it would appear that you would agree from a historical point of view that art does belong together or in the heart of STEM, as I argue, and the humanities too, and that therefore my argument to the engineers or other such appropriate audiences as I can find may not be entirely unjustified, but actually have some truth, merit, and benefit to it, hopefully.
I think so. But remember not to forget the social sciences. I think we need STEAMs, plural, because the social sciences often fall into this crack getting lumped in with the humanities.
I lump them all
but they
together,
are, yeah. They, it's one can. And using arts for all of them celebrates arts. And I do think they are all arts or crafts. But there's a lot more defense of the humanities going on than there is defense of the social sciences, even as, the dismantling of public infrastructure has been decimating the social sciences even more than it is the arts and humanities, because the social sciences rely on these big studies and use of data and so on to be able to say things like this traffic change will help, right? And so we need to always unpack arts to arts, humanities, and social sciences when we're defending them, and work as a society on recognizing that. I think we have come to recognize that we need to battle extensive evils, that the problems around us are systemic problems. We're pretty good at thinking about that, but we keep pointing at and wanting intensive solutions.
Hence the belief in AI or ASI, artificial superintelligence, as the silver bullet for everything. Even like I argued with Zoltan Istvan recently. I've had him on he's running for governor in California now, and I've had him on my podcast 3 times. And, he made this post like, if you vote for me, artificial intelligence, robotics, and advanced science would bring safety and security to our streets or something like that. And my comment was like, Zoltan, there's endless examples of much safer communities and countries all over the world which do not resort to more robotics, artificial intelligence, or any of those things you're promising, and yet produce the results you're claiming, or at least much better results than what you're seeing in California at any rate. And Canada, to a large degree, is a good example of that, by the way. Mm-hmm. So therefore, it's not necessarily true to say that these kind of technological problems are panaceas to our social issues. Like, but unfortunately, I have found myself over the last 15 years actually I've never been the popular opinion in the room, but maybe in the last few years with the increasing in the power of AI, there was a moment where I was more kind of able to relate to people, and now again people have gone all the way into the AI sphere on average, like as the solution.
Right.
And that's kind of really scaring me, to be honest with you. And that's why I want to ask you this next thing is like, and you tell me, I don't want to put any words in your mouth. So, are there any modern equivalents of inventing the Renaissance? Where do you see such golden age myths operating today, whether in tech, whether in politics, whether in culture, whether in
Yeah.
society at large?
Well, so we certainly see invocation of golden age, both in the if the singularity happens and goes well, we will then have a golden age. And you also see it in MAGA. You also see it in the nationalistic imaginary past, make America great again, like this imaginatively constructed, non existent, but nonetheless clearly envisioned Christian nationalist state. If we do that, we will be great again.
And that's carrying the day.
And yeah, well, no, it's having its day in the tumults where the world swings back and forth with incredible rapidity.
Okay.
Right, and we're in the bit where the world swings back and forth with incredible rapidity. And Florence had 5 regime changes by the time Machiavelli was 12. We're in that bit. And if that bit results in raising some people who have the degree of faithfulness to the people that Machiavelli did, then we'll be in good hands. Because I think growing up, seeing tumult after tumult after tumult, realizing, wait a minute, this isn't a trajectory one way or another. This is this is tumult after tumult. Makes us realize what we need to work for is the good of the people and the stability of the countryside, and that we need that humility. We need humility among everybody, including and especially among policy wonk people. And
I recently wrote an article, Ignorance is the Greatest Evil, Why Certainty Does More Harm Than Malice, which is not really that original. That's what Socrates argued, for God's sake. Right? I kind of just modernized it.
Yeah. So Francis Bacon in 1600 was struggling with an interesting problem. Bacon was, I'm introducing what's going to feel like a complete non sequitur for about 4 minutes, and then it's going to come back and connect to 3 things we were just talking about. But Bacon was the popularizer, the voice, the charismatic face of the scientific movement that was happening. Others were doing great experiments and discovering, observing. Bacon was going to articulate this in a core text and make the argument what we need as a country and as a civilization is to create academies of sciences and to invest in the discovery of technologies, and that these will enable progress in which the human condition will get better with every generation because we will have better food, better medicine, better housing. We will be warmer in winter. We will not run out of, we will improve the human condition. But the scientific method is actually very difficult to justify when you haven't been doing it, because you don't have what we have. When we ask, does science work? We always say, yes, look, here is a laptop. It's made of science, and it does all of this stuff. Here is a vaccine. It's made of science. It does all of this stuff. Here are my glasses. They're made of science. They do all of this stuff. Here are all of these things we made with science, and they do things. Therefore, we know the scientific method works. It's created all of these intensive goods. When Bacon and his peers are articulating it, they don't think that the scientific method has been used in the past. It's new. They're trying to argue this is going to be the beginning of progress. Everything before this was chance / God's providential plan, whatever. But this is going to be the beginning of anthropogenic, deliberate progress. How do you prove that progress works? So first, you use the rhetorical argument to get people to want there to be progress. And this is where Bacon uses the beautiful simile of the three insects, the ant, the spider, and the honeybee. It says there are three types of users of knowledge. There is the ant who travels around and collects grains of knowledge wherever he finds them and piles them into a big pile. And he is the encyclopedist who makes a massive assembly of knowledge and then sits on top, proud that he has the most. And then there is the spider, the theorist, the system weaver, who weaves elaborate webs of logical argumentation and theory and proof. And they're beautiful and enchanting and easy to get hypnotized and entranced and trapped within. But they're just made out of the stuff of his own being. He's really spinning castles out of himself and not out of nature. And then, says Bacon, there is the honeybee, who, gathering from among the fruits of nature, processes what he gathers through the organ of his own being to produce something that is sweet and useful for humankind. And that is the scientist. And that is what we want to be. And there is, he says, no greater act of charity, of traditional Christian charity, than to be a scientist. For what more charitable act could there be than to invent something that will improve the life of every human being who will live after you? It's a beautiful rhetorician. But when people ask Bacon, how can you prove that this will work? How can you prove that if we do science and we study and measure and analyze and grind and pipette and all the other things we do, that we will actually develop things that are good and useful for humankind? We've never done this before. This is new. What is your evidence? People who are used to the modern secular way of thinking about science are very surprised, usually. Bacon's argument is, from the goodness of God. We know, he says, that God is omnibenevolent, and a kind maker would not send us naked out into the wilderness, full of unmet needs and desires without the means to meet them. He who gave the lion claws and the woodpecker his beak, and gave each species that which it needs to meet its desires, filled us with the desires for peace, for curing diseases, for being warm in winter, for clothing ourselves, for traveling, for all of these different things, for knowing the world around us. He would not send us naked into the wilderness without some tool that can meet all human desire. Therefore, reason, which is the gift of God to man, is capable of meeting all human need. With that argument, Bacon's rhetoric persuades an excited England and then an excited Europe to invest enormous moonshot money in academies of sciences and wanting to be the honeybee. This is, by the way, Bacon doing what Petrarch wanted to teach people
Rhetoric.
to do. Right, rhetoric, the words that sting and bite
Pure
and
rhetoric.
cause movements. Yes. And from this gorgeous and pure rhetoric, we get the vast investment in an acceleration of scientific change, which was already happening. But Bacon is an inflection point that makes it popular, makes everyone feel excited by and invested in it. And that rhetoric helps and transforms it. But notice that he's arguing for it from a position of giving and humaneness and kindness, and that this is something we need to meet needs. And the honeybee gathers from among the fruits of nature, right? And we have all of these studies that show if we implement this policy, we can improve homelessness. If we implement this policy, like we can gather from the fruits of nature. We can look at all the different countries of the world and their policies and see what's working, and we can imitate them. And we can gather them and process them through the organ of our being, which is logic, figure out how they work and say, okay, this is the country that's done really well with homelessness, right? And homelessness is in a really good position.
But why should we do
in one
that when we
country.
know that homelessness is caused by stupid, lazy people who don't want to work and just want to collect government money?
We know that is true when we exercise our organ as scientists. And it's true we have to work hard against the providentialist thinking that wants to say that all evils happen to people because they deserve them. That is an inheritance from puritanical Calvinism. Which is notably one of the reasons that countries with a dominantly Protestant Christian tradition have struggled with this more than countries with a dominantly Catholic one, because dominantly Catholic Christianity's message is everybody sins, everybody messes up, everybody is guilty. Even St. Francis of Assisi sins all the time. Our only hope is to repent and apologize for our sins and try to do better. It is in the Calvinist tradition that these puritanical ideas of purity and never erring, and if a bad thing happened to you, it's not a test, right? Perfection come, which is why there has been much more effective political solidarity, union across movements, all sorts of things in Catholic tradition nations than in Protestant tradition nations, even among like atheists, right? Because the rhetoric and thought processes around purity, which is what Alexis Shotwell's book is about, are inherited and disseminate far beyond the religion into the way we think about everything, including why are people homeless? Oh, it's because there's something wrong with them and they did something. Or why are people homeless? Because the world is imperfect and we need to work to make it better. So if we want to be honeybees, and I think we want to be honeybees, I mean, Bacon is absolutely manipulating us with manipulative rhetoric, but we want to be honeybees. We need to gather from the fruits of nature and process it through the organ of our own being. And we need to do many experiments. One of the things that I fear with the current focus on AI is that people are like, and therefore we don't need to do these other observations and experiences. We don't need to also gather from the fruits of nature. Many people who are doing AI are acting more like spiders or like ants than like honeybees, because they're piling up information saying, as long as we have all the data and put it in a pile, it'll magically awaken. And others, so long as we develop this thing and spin it in our own image, it will awaken. And neither the ant nor the spider gave us vaccines. Neither the spider nor the ant gave us what we have. The honeybee did. And we need to, I think, pursue other studies in parallel. I read a great article recently about Parkinson's, confirming that Parkinson's is definitely caused by chemical exposure. And in the article, the researcher, whose name I wish I could remember, talked about how Parkinson's research was slowed down for a long time by the Human Genome Project and its after effects, because we were so excited by genetics that for a long time you could only get genetics research money, and all the research money was going to genetics. And at one point they found like one gene that had a slight correlation with Parkinson's, so all the Parkinson's research went into genetic stuff. And she thinks we would have figured this out a decade ago if the money had been distributed more plurally and it weren't all being drunk up by one mode of research. But genetics is giving us tons of stuff, right? It gave us the RNA vaccines. It gave us so many things. We absolutely were right to invest in genetics, but not to let it drink up 90% of the research money. We should have given it 50% of the research money, right? Or 60 or 70. And if we had, then other things like understanding chemical exposure might have advanced faster and we might be in a better position. And so I always feel fear when one form of research eats up everything. And
that's my concern.
So, 90% of research is going into one technology. And I don't need to know what technology that is to say we should never invest 90% of our eggs in one basket.
But the problem now, that's my concern. The problem is that we are putting literally trillions of dollars in AI, literally. And we're putting nothing, almost comparatively speaking, into humanity. And then we're wondering why the gap is growing, right? So it's like you having two kids. One is called AI and one is called human. And then you're giving all the education, the money, the resources to your AI kid. And you're completely ignoring, if not abandoning, your human child. Because you see, the future belongs to the AI kid. The machines are the future, right?
And importantly, the human kid in your simile is the elder sibling, and the one that's closer to being able to actually yield fruit that's useful. And so we've stopped doing the stuff that works, right? The studies that produce policy that we know how to implement, that we can actually act on now, because we're hoping that the AI kid is going to grow up and take on that burden while we're starving the kid who's old enough to work, right? And we need to depend on that kid, and we need that kid to be functional, because just as in the late 1400s, there was crisis as a result of the inescapable factors of centralization of state power, increase of army size, dissemination of gunpowder, corruption of the church. And that was a guaranteed recipe for war. And even though I've run the simulation 15 times, it sometimes feels like we almost made peace. No, we never managed to make peace. There was guaranteed war, but there were some techniques that could mitigate it, and people invested in those techniques, and they did mitigate it. They didn't prevent it, but they did mitigate it. Similarly, right now, there's always enormous political volatility during an information tech revolution. We are in the middle of a digital information tech revolution. Information is moving in different complicated ways in every new year as we develop new effects of the digital transformation. That's an ongoing rollout that always causes massive upheavals and massive political strife in exactly the way that the print revolution did. And why were the wars of religion in France so big and so bad? And how did they get so widespread so fast? The answer was printing. The answer was the printing press. When the wars Machiavelli is worried about happened, the printing press was in a much less developed state. So that when Savonarola published an inflammatory pamphlet in Florence, it takes 2 weeks for it to get even as far as Milan. It circulates a little bit around small areas, but is really, only affecting those small areas. And that revolutionary movement can be stomped on and put down. When Luther makes the 95 Theses public, they're in print in London in 17 days after they're made public in Wittenberg, because a tech revolution had happened, and the giant Reformation wars explode onto the human stage with unprecedented speed, and are the first time that Europe has to count its war dead in hundreds of thousands instead of tens of thousands. Every time there's an infotech revolution, there is a massive political upheaval. We're in the middle of that massive political upheaval, which is not the moment to say, let's starve the one kid who's old enough to actually work while we're waiting for the little kid to grow up. We need to feed that adult kid too, because we don't need solutions that the AI kid will produce some amorphous 5, 10, 15 years from now. We need the mitigation now. And we need extensive goods that will empower people to deal better with a massively volatile political situation that is caused by the ongoing rollout of the infotech revolution. Infotech revolutions roll out slowly. The first couple decades are slow as the saturation of the tech is slow. Similarly, the first decade impact of computers and even the second decade impact of computers was substantial, but it was not the political consequences. The political consequences really start in the third decade of the existence of computers. And if we're on the same track as the print rollout, we're due for another 50 years of extreme volatility. This is not the moment to starve the kid who's old enough to work.
Yeah, and that's basically been the impetus behind my work for the last 16 years. And just one example that I've given recently is the kind of the way people want to solve propaganda issues with technical solutions, which may have place and do have place, but it is more useful, I think, in the medium to long run, especially if we take the solution that Finland has come up with, which is to train its kids from early on to recognize the propaganda as they see it, to recognize it as a way of rational process, rather than sort of an external technical solution imposed from above, right?
Yeah.
But let me ask you this, because we're approaching 3 hours here, and I hope we can wrap up the next 3 questions by the time the third hour is over.
Perfect.
Your goal isn't to give us your renaissance in your book, Inventing the Renaissance, but to teach us to question everyone's version.
Yes.
So what's the most important question you want listeners to ask when someone promises them a golden age, whether past or future? I am here and I'm running for governor or whatever, and I say, if you vote for me, not only would I make America great again, I'll make the world great again, and I'll bring in artificial intelligence, which will trigger a new golden age of immortality, life abundance, a future that's better than you think. For example, I mean, there's endless examples I just came up with.
Yeah. I think it has to be two questions, because one of them is this person talking about an age that will lay golden eggs or an age that will be golden to live in? And are they subtle enough to have realized that those are not the same thing and that they have to think hard about them?
Love that.
The second question is disruption really going to yield more than continuity? Right? The things that were great in the Renaissance were continued developments out of the Middle Ages. Right? Banking got more sophisticated, not all at once in a, but we figured this out, and then this, and then, agriculture getting a little better, textile production getting a little better, education getting a little better. And disruption is a big rhetorical favorite in the business world that has been spreading from there to others, right? We want to be a disruptive technology. We want to break the old system and bring in a new thing, because that's where big profits come fast. Big profits are not a golden age to live through, even if they do lay a golden egg for somebody. And so much more often, building upon what's there is what actually made the good thing happen, not scrapping something and replacing it with something new. So to always ask the question, is this person going to build on existing knowledge, existing strengths, and help that long trajectory continue to go up? Or is this person going to try to dismantle things that are already, in fact, working well and changing for the better, and replace them with something else in a disruption way? I'm always extremely skeptical of disruption rhetoric.
It's funny that you say that. So first of all, those two things are utterly brilliant in my opinion, and I love them. Whether you're laying the golden eggs or whether you're creating a golden age to actually live in, right? So that's brilliant, and so is the second part. It reminds me so much about, I wrote this transhumanist manifesto 16 years ago. Was very popular among the transhumanist community, and it was kind of a Marxist one, but replaced capitalism with like immortality, and we only have biology to lose and immortality to gain, is how I finish in the end, like utter nonsense. And then I wrote a reflection on it, and it was like Transhumanist Manifestos and Dilemmas, a decade and a half of reflection. And it surprised me in two ways. I talked in it about how manifestos are all about revolutions, and dilemmas are about introspection. And how, unfortunately, I've seen so many people willing to do violence to the present in order to destroy everything, to allegedly start building the future afresh. And how after 15 years, while manifestos are so much easier to write and so much popular and so simple, black and white, and convenient in justifying your actions, I have returned more to the form of introspection rather than, and dilemmas, embracing the dilemmas rather than embracing manifestos. And what even shocked me even more is that this kind of went viral. It had like 80,000 downloads audio, because I also did the audio version of it, and it had like on SoundCloud, it had like 75 or 80,000 downloads, which kind of shocked me. But this is kind of where I found myself after 15 years, to the point where I was almost ashamed that I have written the original Transhumanist Manifesto that I did write 16 years ago. And that was so popular that people voted for it in Bulgaria, where I'm from, and it was pushed forward to the World Transhumanist Association to become the manifesto, and people argued, and I had nothing to do with any of that. But like, and then when I told those guys I'm kind of ashamed of it now, and I unfortunately don't see it as simple as I was seeing it back in the day, and of course, even worse, I'm afraid that people who embrace that kind of revolutionary zeal end up destroying the world in order to save it.
Yeah.
So like, yeah.
Yeah. Well, you've hit on a very important phrase, and one that is very dear to me and important to me, which is the question of is it the right choice to destroy this world to make a better one, or to destroy this world to save a better one, which is one of the central questions in my Terra Ignota novels.
Absolutely.
And I often run into people, many connected with the AI world, who will tell me, "Oh, I loved Too Like the Lightning."
Yes.
And they didn't read the rest of it.
Because they're move fast and break things.
They are. And Too Like the Lightning raises the question of somebody who did feel it was right to destroy this world to make a better one or save a better one. And the long examination of the series is, and no, that is not an acceptable answer, and that was a harmful answer. But a lot of people don't want to go ahead and face that answer. But looking at it another way, a historical source of this problem is there are several lies about history that we have all learned and unintentionally repeat. One of which is related to the Dark Age, Golden Age myth, is the idea that somehow there's blank slate and a new world order. And the blank slate and new world order is also totally mythical and never happened. But it's how we narrate the American Revolution. It's often how we narrate the French Revolution. It's how we narrate the Renaissance after the Black Death. And we sort of tell this lie about the fall of Rome as if the fall of Rome wiped everything away overnight, and then suddenly new thing happened, and it was a bad new world order, but it was a new world order. And all of these had so much more continuity than we get taught when we get taught the simple version in our high school textbooks. There was so much continuity. And we're not used to thinking in terms of continuity. And again, putting on my head as a science fiction writer, so many science fiction worlds are X occurred, and then there was a blank slate and a new world order. So, for example, in my Terra Ignota, I deliberately don't do that. And here we are in the 25th century. We have flying cars and advanced robots, and the European Union is still there. And there's still a king of Spain. And people are using Latin in new ways in exactly the same way they've been using Latin in new ways every century for the last X number of centuries. And we have a moon base, but we also still have all of these other familiar things. Because continuity is real. And blank slate new world order is a lie and is propagandistically the way we're taught to imagine. I remember a few years ago, I was brought in by the X Prize Foundation to consult on a project to try to, they wanted to set up a prize to incentivize a technology that would revolutionize housing by 2050. Or it might have been 2030 at that point. And everyone was talking about smart homes and high-tech new stuff. And I was the only voice in the room that said the majority of buildings that we live in 2050 have already been built. If you want to revolutionize housing by 2050, you're talking about you're talking about inventing a technology that will revolutionize how we occupy buildings that already exist. The example I arrived at was wearable climate control, right? If we create wearable temperature control so that we don't have to heat and cool housing, then the enormous numbers of houses that will need to be retrofitted as the planet's temperature balance changes would not have to be retrofitted, and so many more things would be used in different and new and less costly ways, right? That would revolutionize housing, because the majority of houses that will exist in 2050 exist now. But everyone was thinking about house of the future, new houses, not existing houses. We're trained to think about the new and not about continuity. And even if the singularity comes, the majority of houses we live in are going to be the houses that have already been built. And the roads that exist are going to be the roads we built on top of the roads the Romans built. Um, because it would be a big change on the scale of the printing press. And it would have big changes for how we know things on the scale of the printing press. But nobody imagines that the printing press wiped away everything and there was no continuity. We shouldn't expect that now. That myth is coming from propagandistic histories, mostly of the US, that want to deny continuity both with European tradition and with what happened to the indigenous population. And so really like the tabula rasa, blank slate New World Order narrative, and that gets told over and over about America specifically and is a very American narrative, though it saturates the way the whole world thinks about history. Certainly via how so much science fiction is produced in America by Americans. And so a huge portion of the imagined futures we have consumed, the images of the future we paint, use tabula rasa New World Order. But no historian will ever say there was tabula rasa New World Order. There were always traditions and habits and taboos and technologies and objects inherited and repurposed.
I know, but it seems that people are willing to burn the world to supposedly rebuild it. And they are super eager to start the burning at the first call of any random, populist, saying, fire up the torches. And there'll be like almost shocking number of people who are willing to do that. And many of them intelligent,
because
many
we
of them...
know how to destroy. We know how to destroy. It's not daunting. We don't know how to fix. Building is hard.
It's freaking hard.
Figuring out what we have to do, how to build, is really scary and overwhelming. And we're hitting here with option paralysis. And we don't know what to do. And if someone sends you into a room and says, optimize this room to make it better, you don't know what to do. You spend a lot of time thinking. If someone sends you into a room and says, destroy everything in this room, you know what to do.
Yeah.
Destruction, we know how to do it. And improvement, doing better than anyone ever did before, that's daunting. Of course it's daunting. Of course it's emotionally challenging. Of course it requires more courage. And of course it's exhausting. Of course we get tired of waking up in the morning finding ourselves having to try to do something no one ever did before. But you know who else woke up in the morning and had to do something no one else had ever done before every day? Machiavelli.
Yeah. And Dante
and
too, by
Petrarch,
the way.
And Bacon, and Dante, and our parents, and our grandparents, and every generation in between. They all lived through this. And one thing I think that's affecting us a lot, with climate change in particular, a lot of people, I think, feel like we're facing an apocalypse that's unique, that is an existential threat on a scale that the past has never known. And that's just not true. Humans have been facing existential threats for a long time. The Cold War was absolutely an existential threat. The Black Death was an existential threat. The French armies, the way Petrarch describes them, he is absolutely as terrified of them as we are of climate change. All of these were existential threats. All of them people faced. And we are not alone in this generation in having to face something that scary. Most past generations had to face something just as scary. And it was hard. And they tried to solve it. And they didn't solve it. And they had very partial victories, not complete victories. And they didn't save the day. I found myself at the end of one class talking to my students about what they had done in our year's version of the Italian Wars, and how some of them had worked really hard and managed a great, great effort to save 2 cities, while 8 others burned, but they had saved those 2 cities. And I said, in 1492, a dam was gonna break. There was gonna be a war. And nothing could stop the dam from breaking. But you worked hard and you dug channels and you directed that water and you saved the things you worked hard to save. And other things were destroyed, but you did gain by that hard work. And then I went home and reread The Prince and realized I had forgotten that that's how Machiavelli ends The Prince. And he says that these forces are like a river in flood, and nothing can stop the river. But if we build our fortifications and our drainage and our preparations for the flood, then we can direct it away from us. And I had arrived at, by just observing my students, the same exact thing. We need to build those dikes. And that is scary and difficult. And so it's okay for us to look at ourselves and say, you know what, we're being asked to do something incredibly hard. But our ancestors were asked to do it too. And they rose to the occasion, and we are not alone in being asked to rise to the occasion. It feels like more is being asked of us than has ever been asked. And it's true, more is being asked of us than has ever been asked of us. But it was asked of our grandparents, and it was asked of their grandparents, and it was asked of their grandparents. And I feel comfort in knowing our generation is not alone, but has solidarity across time in what's being asked of us.
Well, Ada, this is a fantastic place to stop our conversation, I think. Unless you want to add anything else to send us away with, I think this is an absolute sort of catharsis almost, for me at least. I hope it's the same for our audience.
Yeah, there's one detail that I didn't manage to fit in that I intended to, and I kind of don't want to diffuse that catharsis. But when I'm talking to people who care deeply about the singularity, there's an incredibly awesome book by Anne Blair, Blair, called Too Much to Know, TOO. And it's about the last time the singularity happened. What I mean by that is, a big core of what people mean when they say the singularity is the moment when humans don't know our own knowledge because we make a thing that makes discoveries on its own, and our technology sweeps past us and we no longer know what it is. And we are justifiably very worried about this question of what happens when humans can no longer know everything, when there is knowledge that we don't have. This happened before. It happened in the 1570s. That was the moment at which the world, in the throes of the printing press crisis, realized it was no longer possible for one person to read every book. Up until that point, books had multiplied slowly, so that to be a learned person was to have read all the books. Or if you hadn't read every single book you were familiar with, you knew the title of every book. And you may only know summaries of the ones that are outside your field, but you knew all the books, you knew all the authors. And we got to the 1570s and there were too many books. And the books were multiplying exponentially. And people realized, oh my God, no one can know all the things. You can't know all the fields anymore. You can't know all the authors. You can't be familiar with all the fields. No one will be a learned person anymore. It isn't possible for us to have our own knowledge. It'll be siloed and divvied up, and each person will have only their little component of knowledge, and the majority of knowledge will be off amorphously where we can't have it. And it was the same fear. It was the same crisis. And it's really amazing looking at her study of how everyone freaked out. And it was the end of the world. It was the beginning of the world. It was a revolution in what knowledge meant. It was the end of education and the possibility of humans being in control of their own destiny. It was so many things we talk about now. And I think that everyone who is thinking of this moment as the most important change in history and the beginning of a totally new moment in history would benefit from looking at Too Much to Know. It's not a fun, witty, delightful read. It's a serious academic read, but it's not a dry, slow read either, But it's so powerful to realize that we aren't the first generation even to have this specific anxiety about our knowledge becoming bigger than us. Our knowledge has been bigger than us for a long time. There are masses and masses of books out there and we don't know what's in them. And we dip into the sea and we work with what we can get from it. And we ask the library, what do you have on this? And even within one library, I'm sure I've only read 100th of what it has on the topic, right? And the last time we faced this crisis, it did scare us. And we did feel like it might, in an important way, be the end of history and the beginning of new history. So again, in the continuity sense, this is a continuation of that information revolution. Humanity has been living ever since the printing press in a long string of information revolutions. As the printing press disseminated, as radio joined it, as audio recording and video recording joined those, as computers joined those, we are a species now 550 years native to information revolutions. We're as native to them as Galapagos animals to the Galapagos. We have weathered this storm. We have faced this predator. We have faced this threat. Like any species native to a place with a threat, it has killed us and harmed us, but others of us have lived. And we do ourselves a disservice when we pretend it's absolutely out of nowhere, new and unprecedented. We must recognize it as continuity, a continuation of this ongoing transformation, as there is too much to know and knowledge outstrips us. But knowledge already outstripped us. And we can draw on how past generations have been coping with this already achieved state when we look at the state what we think is coming. So do I believe in the singularity? Yes, I believe we hit it in 1570. And that we are in the later stages of it, and it is continuing to unfold.
I'm not sure if I accept your metaphor fully, but I accept your impetus and your kind of historical perspective on it as an enriching and rewarding and illuminating idea on the mythology surrounding, the singularity and transhumanism and artificial intelligence and even humanism, of who we are, where we're coming from and where we're going. Mm-hmm. And most importantly, the idea about what kind of questions we need to ask anytime and every time when there is some kind of mythology like that. And that would kind of broaden our horizon and enrich us and hopefully help us not repeat or make the same mistakes again. So all I can say is thank you very much for your book. It's been absolutely illuminating for me, and it will always be there in the background when I'm looking at golden ages or historical periods and dark ages and things like that, apocalypses or you name it. And it's been an absolute privilege to talk to you today.
Thank you. It's been an honor to be back. I knew this would be a fabulous conversation. Thank you.